البريطانية. لندن، 30 من نوفمبر 2019. في الذكرى 70 لتأسيسها، رغم تعرض وكالة الأونروا للاستهداف من قبل إسرائيل وقطع التمويل الأمريكي، فإنها لا تزال تؤدي عملها. ما هو الدور المنتظر منها في مساعدة اللاجئين الفلسطينيين؟ وهل لا يزال يعول عليها في نضال اللاجئين من أجل عودتهم إلى ديارهم؟ الأونروا، تحديات الاستجابة للأزمات والسعي نحو بناء مستقبل عادل. مؤتمر بحثي ينظمه مركز الجزيرة للدراسات ومركز العودة الفلسطيني بالاشتراك مع المركز الأوروبي للدراسات الفلسطينية بجامعة إكستر البريطانية. لندن، 30 من نوفمبر 2019. في الذكرى 70 لتأسيسها، رغم تعرض وكالة الأونروا للاستهداف من قبل إسرائيل وقطع التمويل الأمريكي، فإنها لا تزال تؤدي عملها. ما هو الدور المنتظر منها في مساعدة اللاجئين الفلسطينيين؟ وهل لا يزال يعول عليها في نضال اللاجئين من أجل عودتهم إلى ديارهم؟ الأونروا، تحديات الاستجابة للأزمات والسعي نحو بناء مستقبل عادل. مؤتمر بحثي ينظمه مركز الجزيرة للدراسات ومركز العودة الفلسطيني بالاشتراك مع المركز الأوروبي للدراسات الفلسطينية بجامعة إكستر البريطانية. لندن، 30 من نوفمبر 2019. في الذكرى 70 لتأسيسها، رغم تعرض وكالة الأونروا للاستهداف من قبل إسرائيل وقطع التمويل الأمريكي، فإنها لا تزال تؤدي عملها. ما هو الدور المنتظر منها في مساعدة اللاجئين الفلسطينيين؟ وهل لا يزال يعول عليها في نضال اللاجئين من أجل عودتهم إلى ديارهم؟ الأونروا، تحديات الاستجابة للأزمات والسعي نحو بناء مستقبل عادل. مؤتمر بحثي ينظمه مركز الجزيرة للدراسات ومركز العودة الفلسطيني بالاشتراك مع المركز الأوروبي للدراسات الفلسطينية بجامعة إكستر البريطانية. لندن، 30 من نوفمبر 2019. في الذكرى 70 لتأسيسها، رغم تعرض وكالة الأونروا للاستهداف من قبل إسرائيل وقطع التمويل الأمريكي، فإنها لا تزال تؤدي عملها. ما هو الدور المنتظر منها في مساعدة اللاجئين الفلسطينيين؟ وهل لا يزال يعول عليها في نضال اللاجئين من أجل عودتهم إلى ديارهم؟ الأونروا، تحديات الاستجابة للأزمات والسعي نحو بناء مستقبل عادل. مؤتمر بحثي ينظمه مركز الجزيرة للدراسات ومركز العودة الفلسطيني بالاشتراك مع المركز الأوروبي للدراسات الفلسطينية بجامعة إكستر البريطانية. لندن، 30 من نوفمبر 2019. في الذكرى 70 لتأسيسها، رغم تعرض وكالة الأونروا للاستهداف من قبل إسرائيل وقطع التمويل الأمريكي، فإنها لا تزال تؤدي عملها. ما هو الدور المنتظر منها في مساعدة اللاجئين الفلسطينيين؟ وهل لا يزال يعول عليها في نضال اللاجئين من أجل عودتهم إلى ديارهم؟ الأونروا، تحديات الاستجابة للأزمات والسعي نحو بناء مستقبل عادل. مؤتمر بحثي ينظمه مركز الجزيرة للدراسات ومركز العودة الفلسطيني بالاشتراك مع المركز الأوروبي للدراسات الفلسطينية بجامعة إكستر البريطانية. لندن، 30 من نوفمبر 2019. في الذكرى 70 لتأسيسها، رغم تعرض وكالة الأونروا للاستهداف من قبل إسرائيل وقطع التمويل الأمريكي، فإنها لا تزال تؤدي عملها. ما هو الدور المنتظر منها في مساعدة اللاجئين الفلسطينيين؟ وهل لا يزال يعول عليها في نضال اللاجئين من أجل عودتهم إلى ديارهم؟ الأونروا تحديات الاستجابة للأزمات والسعي نحو بناء مستقبل عادل. مؤتمر بحثي ينظمه مركز الجزيرة للدراسات ومركز العودة الفلسطيني بالاشتراك مع المركز الأوروبي للدراسات الفلسطينية بجامعة إكستر البريطانية. لندن، 30 من نوفمبر 2019. في الذكرى 70 لتأسيسها، رغم تعرض وكالة الأونروا للاستهداف من قبل إسرائيل وقطع التمويل الأمريكي، فإنها لا تزال تؤدي عملها. ما هو الدور المنتظر منها في مساعدة اللاجئين الفلسطينيين؟ وهل لا يزال يعول عليها في نضال اللاجئين من أجل عودتهم إلى ديارهم؟ الأونروا تحديات الاستجابة للأزمات والسعي نحو بناء مستقبل عادل. مؤتمر بحثي ينظمه مركز الجزيرة للدراسات ومركز العودة الفلسطيني بالاشتراك مع المركز الأوروبي للدراسات الفلسطينية بجامعة إكستر البريطانية. لندن، 30 من نوفمبر 2019. في الذكرى 70 لتأسيسها، رغم تعرض وكالة الأونروا للاستهداف من قبل إسرائيل وقطع التمويل الأمريكي، فإنها لا تزال تؤدي عملها. ما هو الدور المنتظر منها في مساعدة اللاجئين الفلسطينيين؟ وهل لا يزال يعول عليها في نضال اللاجئين من أجل عودتهم إلى ديارهم؟ الأونروا تحديات الاستجابة للأزمات والسعي نحو بناء مستقبل عادل. مؤتمر بحثي ينظمه مركز الجزيرة للدراسات ومركز العودة الفلسطيني بالاشتراك مع المركز الأوروبي للدراسات الفلسطينية بجامعة إكستر البريطانية.
I want to firstly thank everyone who has agreed to come and speak and moderate the events. Very briefly, I just want to give you some housekeeping information for the day. The whole conference will be live streamed on Al Jazeera Arabic, and the same stream should be shown on PRC's Facebook page. If you'd like to tweet, please use the conference hashtag UNRWA70. In the conference booklet, you can find details about the venue and emergency numbers. Also, please bear in mind when you go into the break room that there might be other events taking place in the rooms surrounding the area. There will be available complimentary refreshments and a light lunch at the times listed in the booklet, so please help yourself. During the breaks, I recommend having a look at the slides shown in the screen and brought to you by the Palestinian History Tapestry project. Also, just want to mention something about the program. Unfortunately, in the second session, Jalal Al-Husseini and Ricardo Bocco will not be here with us. They were not able to come to the UK, unfortunately. But I'm sure the excellent speakers on that panel will be able to compensate for their absence. Lastly, I want to introduce the welcome speeches, which will be given by Tarek Hamoud. Firstly, he's the General Director of the Palestinian Return Center, and then after that, Arafat Mahdi Shukri, who is a senior researcher at the Al Jazeera Center for Studies. After those speeches, we will go directly into starting the opening session. I hope you enjoy the conference, and thank you again for being here with us.
Good morning. Dear distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I am very pleased to join you today for this year's conference about UNRWA. It is an honor to address you as the General Director of the Palestinian Return Center, an organization in consultative status with the UN Social and Economic Council since 2015. I am equally honored to address you as a refugee who knows how it feels like to grow up in refugee camps, torn away from the nourishment of home and warmth of family. I studied at UNRWA schools, Tur'an and Ain al-Zitoun in Lemzirib town south of Syria. My schools were named after Palestinian villages in Galilee. UNRWA is a stark reminder of my childhood memories. My body still carries traces of a vaccination shot injected by an UNRWA nurse. I still remember how during my early childhood days, I mistook the blue UN flag raised over my school building for Palestine's flag. I still also remember how I beat my classmate for the blue flag. I still remember doing my homework on UNRWA's blue notebooks. As a refugee, the blue was the color of my life. It is within UNRWA premises that our awareness of who we are started to take shape. UNRWA was and will forever remain an international witness of the sufferings of Palestinian refugees, of the nature of our identity, of our refugee status, which will only change when our right of return materializes on the ground. It is worth mentioning, to UNRWA's credit, that despite the ad hominem campaigns waged by the US and Israel to rescind the agency's mandate, 170 member states at the UN General Assembly's Fourth Committee voted this month in favor of a resolution to renew the agency's term of office for another 3 years. This vote is an unequivocal rejection of the Israeli campaign to wipe out UNRWA's presence and revoke the inalienable rights of Palestinian refugees, most notably the right of return. The right of return achieved customary status in 1948 when the UN General Assembly passed Resolution 194, affirming the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and obtain restitution and compensation. Like never before in the history of the UN, the Resolution 194 was reaffirmed by the UN more than 135 times. In the same vein, Resolution 2535 recognized that the problem of Palestine Arab refugees has arisen from the denial of their inalienable rights under the Charter of the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Other similar UN resolutions which further strengthen the right of return as indispensable for the solution of the question of Palestine. Taking into consideration the internationally recognized rights of Palestinian refugees, and in line with PRC's intensive efforts to mobilize support for the issue, we will launch an international campaign to garner signatures from Palestinian refugees expressing firm rejection of all attempts to negate Palestinians' right of return. With over 7 million refugees scattered across the globe, the international community should step up efforts to preserve vital services by UNRWA. Until Palestinians' dream to return to their homeland comes true, Palestine refugees will continue to face substantial challenges to the full enjoyment of their rights. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to take this opportunity to thank our partners who have been actively engaged in preparations for this conference, which has seen the day thanks to joint cooperation between the Palestinian Return Center, Al Jazeera Center for Studies, and the European Center for Palestine Studies at the University of Exeter. This event wouldn't have been possible without the exhaustive efforts of PRC's multicultural team. My deepest thanks go Petro Stefanini, Ibrahim Zidani, Bilal Abu Ja'far, Ahmed Hussein, Valentina Durazio for their amazing efforts. I am also equally grateful to the volunteers and all other staff members who have spared no effort to organize the conference. I shall also extend my heartfelt gratitude to all those who have come from nearby and faraway places to share with us their thoughts, support, and solidarity at this very special event. Thank you for being here to stand up together for UNRWA and Palestine refugees. Thank you.
Good morning. I'd like first to express our delight and appreciation for the partnership in this conference with PRC, Palestinian Return Center, and the European Center for Palestine Studies at University of Exeter. Al Jazeera Center for Studies, which I represent here today, was established in 2006 as a think tank extension of Al Jazeera Media Network. It conducts in-depth analysis of the current affairs at both local, regional, and global levels. Its research agenda focuses primarily on geopolitics and strategic developments in the Arab world and the surrounding regions. Based in the heart of the Middle East and operating from within the socio-political and cultural fabrics of the Arab world, Al Jazeera Center for Studies seeks to contribute to knowledge sharing and present a better understanding of the complexity of the matters going on in that region. Without a doubt, the Palestinian issue is still one of the most important issues in the Middle East, despite all of the big events taking place in different parts of the Arab world. Therefore, this issue is always on our agenda for monitoring, analyzing, and evaluating the strategic developments surrounding it. I'm sure we can all agree that the Palestinian issue is going through very difficult and sensitive and critical times, especially after the election of the US President Donald Trump. For different reasons, Trump's policy towards the Arab-Israeli conflict seems to favor Israel in an unprecedented way. Even before the talk about the so-called deal of the century, many Palestinians considered the US administration's role as biased and dishonest broker, However, after the information pertaining the deal was leaked, the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas refused to deal with US officials due to their bias towards Israel. Many people in the region think that the core objective of the so-called deal of this century is to put an end to the Arab-Israeli conflict by adopting the Israeli vision towards the main issues of the Palestinian issue, like the Jerusalem, refugee settlements, and borders. The political decisions the US administration took in the last 2 years concerning Jerusalem, Unruh, Golan Heights, and recently the Israeli settlements show that the Palestinian issue is being considered and decided upon unilaterally, and the Palestinians are not needed anymore. Given these events and tendencies, the importance of our conference today becomes very evident. On this day, 70 years ago, the international community through the United Nations recognized and acknowledged the magnitude of the Palestinian refugees by establishing an agency solely to care for and provide refugees with the relief and work they need until their issue is solved. However, after 70 years, their issue has not been solved. In fact, Palestinian refugees nowadays see their rights and fate are endangered. UNRWA is facing more and more challenges from Israel and lately from the United States to curtail its work or even dismantle it altogether. I believe this conference is a great opportunity to have a new look at UNRWA's work after 70 years, shed light on the challenges it faces, the pitfalls it had, the resources it needs, and the role UNRWA can play to secure a better future for Palestinian refugees. I'm sure that with such distinguished speakers, renowned experts, and smart audience, we will have lively discussions and fruitful outcomes. Thank you very much.
Everybody, is this working? Can you hear me? Yes. Can you hear me okay at the back? Okay, I'm very honoured and delighted to be part of this conference. And this first session, I think, will set us well into the rest of the day, because this is where we're looking at the overall history of the wonderful 70 years of struggle by UNRWA. It's a very special moment, not because of the 70 years only, but because, as Arafat just reminded us, Palestinians are in a particular time because of the current United States policy of attempting to delegitimize everything to do with Palestine, and that, of course, includes UNRWA and the cutting of its budget. I think in the last few months, as we saw decisions by the Americans on Jerusalem, on the Golan Heights, and most recently on settlements and the attempts to delegitimize the West Bank as it stands, it's as though they can't find enough things to try to delegitimize Palestine. And as the first speaker so movingly talked about, UNRWA has been over all these decades, and particularly with its schools, has been such an identity-forming experience for so many, many Palestinians. So I welcome all these wonderful former UNRWA people that we have with us today. I just want to mention one person who, of course, is not with us today, but I think is a symbol of how increasingly difficult it is to function as not only UN bodies in Palestine and particularly in Gaza, but also for all NGOs. You'll all be familiar with the World Vision having to cut 120 jobs in Gaza, putting 40,000 kids unable to access the aid they were having before. And I think that the current 3-year campaign against Mohammed el-Halabi is something we need to bear in mind, because it just symbolizes how, for the lengths that will be gone to try to prevent solidarity and action for Palestinians. So now I want to hand over to our first speaker, who you all know very well, Dr. now Ambassador Hossein Zonwat, who's had such a very distinguished career already, not only as an academic, but also in his rather titanic struggle to operate as the Palestinian representative in America. He managed as brilliantly as anybody possibly could, but I think at a great price to his family. And we particularly are happy and want to welcome him here in London. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Victoria, for this moving introduction. And I tell you, my family is happy in London, and we have President Trump to thank for being relocated to the UK. And good morning, everybody. Sabah al-khair, assalamu alaikum. I am particularly honored and thrilled to be among such distinguished panelists, Karen and Rachel. And may I start by really extending our heartfelt gratitude for you, for UNRWA, for all the service. I remember your work in Gaza and beyond, and meeting you, Karen. And your presence here means a lot to us. And let me say how pleased I am and honored to be speaking to you today at this very, very important occasion alongside the esteemed speakers. And also thank the Palestine Return Center, very good friends and long defenders of the right of return here in the UK and beyond. And of course, with the University of Exeter and the European Center for Palestine and the Al Jazeera Research Center for organizing this timely conference. The issue of refugees, as everyone knows here, goes to the very, very heart of the Palestinian cause. The Palestinian cause began with the forced displacement and disposition of around 2/3 of our nation, and losing 2/3 of our land in 1948. That is the origin of the cause of Palestine. This process of forced exile, displacement, disposition is ongoing until this very moment. Just last week, Israel has declared that it has approved a law, between two parentheses, to annex big parts, swaths of the occupied West Bank. And it was and continues to be a deliberate, since 1948, colonial process of displacement and replacement, as our good friend Professor Ilan Papi accurately described. But let me say this right from the beginning. There will be no resolution to our struggle without a resolution to the origin of the issue, that is the plight and the rights of the Palestinian refugees. And such a resolution must see the refugees able to fulfill and enjoy their rights, including the right of return. Some describe this right as an impossible issue to resolve, some in Israel, of course, with some of their international friends. Let's be clear. For us, this is both a collective and an individual right. My father, Saeed, was born in a beautiful town by the name of Simsim in the south of Palestine, near Asqalan. In 1948, my father lost his home, his land, and as a result, I was born in the Rafah refugee camp to the very south, in the beautiful Rafah, to the very south of Gaza. And there is a story why I was born there, because my father and grandfather, as they were trying to protect their family from the shelling and the killings of 1948, my grandfather kept asking, are we still in Palestine? And they would answer him, yes. At one point he asked, are we still in Palestine? They said, yes, his colleagues, his friends. But if you step one step, you will be in Egypt. There I was born. So he wanted us to stay in Palestine. But let me first make a rather downcast observation, Karen. It is a testament to human failure, our and others' failure, that we are today talking about UNRWA at 70. Just think about what it means. 70 years of refugee camps, of refugee status, of enforced temporary refugee existence. Millions remain stateless and homeless and targeted. Millions, these 7 decades later, suffer the most precarious existence of them all, that of exile. Nothing is more hurtful to a human being than exile, forced exile. Millions are denied their basic right to return home and to live in freedom and self-determination. That is a failure. It is ours and it is the world's. That said, I of course have to commend UNRWA. Like what we just heard from the director of PRC, their work has been tireless and crucial. It has not only kept people alive, but offered them education, opportunities, livelihoods, a chance of betterment. Perhaps most importantly, some hope in this dark time is really giving all these refugees an opportunity. Let me use myself as an example. Upon graduation from Birzeit University in the mid-90s exactly, my first and only choice was to join the United Nations because of exactly what we just heard. Because our life as refugees was all about the blue flag, the 4x4 jeeps, the UN schools, the UN flag flying all over our camps. I grew up with a semi-permanent roof blowing above our heads in our temporary homes. Every day I would see the UNRWA service to all of us, all my generation, all the kids, the children in the schools, in the hospitals, the clinics. And my generation grew up really to look up to, respect, associate ourselves with your service, with your mission, with UNRWA, with the UN. I'm just one of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians of my generation upon which UNRWA left its mark. We have grown up, some of us, to be the voices and representatives of our nation. Some of us have become the professors, the doctors, the geniuses of the IT. All that thanks to UNRWA. UNRWA has been among the most effective investments in human history. This year, UNRWA educates around 500,000 Palestinian kids, children. These 500,000 children will also grow up to be the voices of their generation and to be a force of good for their nation and other nations. And my friends, UNRWA and the care and the support for Palestinian refugees in particular, and refugees in general, is an international moral and legal obligation. We, the Palestinians, did not choose to be refugees. We do not want to be refugees. We cannot wait for the time when we are no longer refugees. UNRWA's continued existence is a manifestation of the international community's commitment to and responsibility under international resolutions on the Palestinian refugee issue and on the Palestinian issue in general. And yet today the political narrative has become so hostile that even this responsibility of caring for refugees until their rights are upheld and implemented, even that is under attack. Even the commitment to uphold international responsibility and care for refugees is being questioned. We have regressed so much in the last few years, thanks to the Trump administration, that we are not talking about the lack of international will to implement the rights of the refugees. We are only attacking the international responsibility to care for them until that will comes about. This is absolutely not right. Refugees everywhere have been a force of good. Even in the US, that is orchestrating this attack. The US was built, by the way, by refugees. And we are now labeled as refugees by various Israeli politicians and officials as a demographic threat. That's the whole political discussion about refugees. And let's once and for all challenge this evolving narrative. The idea that we are somehow exceptional as Palestinians. Only Palestinians as refugees are a threat, a demographic threat. There are international standards, and my colleagues here on the panel know this best, about the rights of refugees in general, what happened in Kosovo and the Balkans and everywhere else. Why we are always made the exception? We owned our homes. My father did own his home. We owned our farms. We lived in our villages for hundreds and hundreds of years, for millennia. We are one of the most ancient nations, if not the most ancient nation. The oldest human community is in Jericho. And therefore, we shall not be the exception. We have a right to go back to our homes, and we will. There is a narrative that is being pushed by the current American administration under President Trump that UNRWA perpetuates the right of return. That's why they have cut their funding to UNRWA, that it was a direct attack, not on UNRWA as an organization, but on our rights. And the narrative originates from Benjamin Netanyahu, publicly, saying that UNRWA keeps the talk, the discussion about the right of return. I have this to say to both Trump and Netanyahu. Refugees' rights, our rights, have nothing to do with the existence of UNRWA or an organization. We commend, we vow, and we will continue working with UNRWA. But our right of return is not associated with an organization. Our right of return, our national rights and individual rights are kept alive by our own insistence on our rights. We do so first of all because we have an agency as Palestinians, and we have pride. We keep our identities alive, our culture, our heritage alive, our history, our oral history, our written history, in every sphere of life, in every corner of every refugee camp. And many of you know this very well. We know where we came from. We know our homes in Jaffa and Haifa and Asqalan and in the hundreds of villages that have been since destroyed. We remember how we got to where we are now. We know what happened in 1947 and 1948. We know in details, and we tell our children. We do not forget. This is why the right of return is alive, and it will continue being alive. Come and ask my son Saeed, who's 8 years old, where are you from? He will immediately tell you, I am from Simpson. He has not seen Simpson, but he knows that is the origin of his father and his grandfather. And I know this goes for every Palestinian refugee, every and each Palestinian refugee. The only thing that is preventing a resolution is not our definition and our defiance, nor the clarity of international law. It is Israel's insistence that the Palestinians alone among the nations do not have the right to return to the lands and homes from where they were forcibly uprooted. Let me fast forward very quickly by saying that this whole attack on UNRWA has been serious. I was in Washington when the attack started. It was very serious. And it was meant to actually see the end of that organization. To cut $300 million in one go instantly was meant to actually dismantle the organization at once. Today we stand and the organization is with us. UNRWA is with us, kicking and screaming and still giving opportunities and life to hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. Thanks to the world. You saw only last week or the week before the resolution on UNRWA. While the US was trying to isolate UNRWA, isolate the Palestinian people, isolate the Palestinian leadership, UNRWA and the Palestinian people and the Palestinian leadership have managed to isolate the US. Only 2 voted against UNRWA in this world. 2. Guess? Yes, even Micronesia did not vote against UNRWA. And there can be no clearer rebuff of the Trump administration's policy on UNRWA than the United Kingdom. Not only did not follow suit, it doubled its contribution. This year, in 2019, the UK contributed £65.5 million, compared to £33.5 million only last year. We thank the government and the people of the UK for this very principled position. The attack on UNRWA is, of course, nothing more and nothing less an attack on the people of Palestine. The US has clearly decided to end the Palestinian issue, to liquidate our rights, and is engaged in a multi-pronged attack. I'm not going to go through the list. You know what happened. The first decision was to close our mission to Washington in November 2017. That was a direct decision to de-recognize the Palestinian peoplehood, collective rights, representation, followed by cutting funding to UNRWA, followed by cutting funding to the Palestinian Authority, to the civil society, followed by the decision on Jerusalem, followed by the decision on the Golan Heights, and all the way to only a couple of weeks ago that settlements are not inconsistent with international law. How shameful, disgraceful. And as such, Israel now has the guts to actually stand in the daylight and tell all of us in the eye that it will annex territory, occupy territory. As such, we have the Minister of Interior Security only a few days ago by the name of Naftali Bennett saying that not only we will kill Palestinians with impunity, but we will not return their bodies. How sick is that? How sick is that? It's this law we have arrived at. I mean, you know, all these years of killing with impunity and violating the very basic international rules is something. And then depriving families of burying their loved ones has nothing to do with politics and narrative. It's sickness. Now, at no point this administration has been willing to respect Palestinian rights, international resolutions, and that's why, my friend Arafat, we decided to boycott this administration, to have a policy of no contact with the administration. We do not engage in international relations only because we want to talk. We engage in international relations because it advances our national rights. Indeed, and here I will be concluding, I just want to say that the US administration ultimate plan is nothing but a real estate deal, because I was there, I was a foot soldier, just a real estate deal. You know how real estate business goes in New York? Somebody gets the property and somebody gets the cash. So the Trump and his team decided that Israel gets the property, gets it all, wins all, and we get some cash. Well, that's one side of it. And we have told them, and maybe this is an opportunity to tell them again, I mean, come on, we are not for sale. We are not for sale. And we can offer you cash if this is really what you are about. But number two, which is much more dangerous than the first, and by the way, number one explains to you the whole Bahrain workshop, the Kushner Bahrain workshop. Because the mindset of this administration is that we, the Palestinian people, we have needs, not rights. We have needs. I'm not going to swear. It's life, I think. The second dimension of this administration is much more dangerous. It is almost, Friedman, the US ambassador to Israel, is on a religious mission. Do you remember the sledgehammer in his hand underneath the old city of Jerusalem? Opening a tunnel, claiming that this tunnel was a tunnel for pilgrims 2,000-3,000 years ago. He is starting the Armageddon. The Armageddon. The religious war. The religious conflict and confrontations, which we resist. We believe this is a political and legal issue that could be resolved. Now, let me just clarify our position and end here. We believe the two-state solution on the 1967 borders is an international responsibility because it was in the first place an international demand. By the way, it was never a Palestinian demand. It was a Palestinian concession. This two-state solution includes these two most important items. First is the end of Israel's occupation that began in 1967 and the creation of a sovereign, independent state of Palestine on the 1967 borders, not based on the 1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as its capital. That's number one. Number two, the full respect and implementation of the right of return and compensation for Palestinian refugees in accordance with UN Resolution 194. One does not and will not come at the expense of the other. May I repeat this? One does not and will not come at the expense of the other. Those who have the illusion that we will be focusing on the state, not the refugees, or the refugees are not the state, are mistaken. This is the formula. This is the maximum we could have offered the world and the minimum we will accept. Yesterday was the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. Only yesterday, the 29th of November. We take our strength first and foremost from our people, our nation. But also, we take it from our friends, our international friends, our Arab brothers and sisters, from the international community and the people of the world. This is our cause, but it is also the world's. This is not just about justice for Palestinians. After all, what does justice for Palestinians mean, if not simply justice for all? Justice for Palestinians is justice for all. And I remember Martin Luther King saying that injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. That is why we see the Palestinian flag now flying everywhere. I wish you were with me in Sheffield only a few weeks ago. And seeing that genuine love and identifying with the people and the flag of Palestine. We see the flag flying everywhere, not only in Sheffield, everywhere, in the UK and beyond. Because our flag is no longer just ours. It is, and it has become a symbol for the struggle for justice everywhere. That gives me hope. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Zomwat. Very comprehensive. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce Karen Abu Zaid, who is like the epitome of the international civil servant at the service of people. She was 20 years in UNHCR, and she worked in Sudan, Namibia, West Africa, the Sierra Leone, Liberian Civil War. Then she was in Bosnia in the worst 4 years of the Bosnian War in Sarajevo. And then she was the Palestine person that for many of us, I first met her in Gaza more years ago than I care to remember, but anyway, a long time ago. And she ended by being Mrs. UNRWA, having been the deputy. She then became the head of UNRWA. And I think everybody who ever worked with her or who knows about UNRWA's work during those years be very, very happy to hear her speak to us about that time. Thank you, Karen.
Well, thank you. And I think we've heard already the beginnings of all the political side of things represented very well by the speakers, and that will be continuing. And so I'm going to go soft and talk to you about my 10 years in Gaza with the Gazans and the Palestine refugees. And I've actually chosen this subject as an opportunity to describe life under Israeli occupation in Gaza and to acquaint others with the heroic Gazans with whom I lived and worked for 10 years, from 2000 to 2010. Their stories, indeed their lives, over decades have been ones of increasing hardship and threats with all the restrictions the occupation imposes. Repeated, sometimes deadly conflict with the neighbor who engages without restraint, often violently, and an overall lack of freedom, including of movement beyond the borders of this 27 by 7 mile territory, resulting in the impossibility to enjoy or even live what could be termed elsewhere as normal life. Yet what one encounters in the territory is not under, when the territory is not under periodic, recurrent military threats from next door, is an appearance of normality. As Gazans go about their work, their schooling, even their recreation, with a determination and an attempt to face and overcome their hardships positively and with mostly good cheer. I recall my decade in Gaza with pleasure, sadness, and anger, as you will appreciate as I describe this period in Gaza. As was mentioned, for 5 years, 2000 to 2005, I served as UNRWA's Deputy Commissioner General under Peter Hansen's Commissioner Generalship. This was very important and much appreciated introduction to a refugee situation which was very different from those in which I had been involved since 1981 with UNHCR, mostly in emergency situations in, as was mentioned, Sudan, Namibia, Sierra Leone, Bosnia, and South Africa. In 2005, on Peter's retirement, I became the Commissioner General, a post I held both gratefully and enthusiastically until 2010, when it became time for me to retire as well, however reluctantly. Having been in the field for most of my 20 years with UNHCR, working with other refugee populations meant being in the relatively safe places where refugees take refuge. For me, this was for the most part, excluding my assignment to Sarajevo during the war. I do not wish to suggest that Gaza was or is what most would describe as safe, but in relative terms, Palestine refugees in Gaza and the West Bank, which UNRWA also served from Gaza headquarters then, along with the Palestinians in Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, they lived at least partially under the authority, however challenged and dictated by the occupying power, of their own Palestinian administration, one in Gaza under Hamas and the other in West Bank under the Palestinian Authority, who has overall charge as well. This meant that the usual care and diplomacy needed to negotiate terms for those who took refugee in foreign lands were not the challenge they often are in the latter case. We had our supporters who were the government there. In Gaza, in particularly, and to a lesser extent in the West Bank, the refugees and UNRWA's challenges instead were with the arbitrary borders established and periodically reestablished by the occupying power, who made their own and ever-changing rules on when, who, what, how much, and how many could cross those borders. What I wish to convey is the disconcerting environment, which in many ways and times during the decade I'm describing appeared to be blatantly contradictory. Normal, on the one hand, since Palestine refugees in Gaza and the West Bank and Jerusalem were at least nominally, although only partially, heroically in charge of their own lives with the semblance of everyday activities under their own auspices, as is the case among non-refugees. I use those terms semblance and partial. This relates to the occupation, which is what it is, and oversight by this hostile neighboring occupier. One need only take note of the ever-increasing encroachment on Palestinian homes, historical and religious sites, their lands, which occurs on a regular basis. Almost daily in Jerusalem and the West Bank, today, often to the extent of destroying homes and farms and other properties and lives. While Palestinians in Gaza during the decade I described went about their lives, working, schooling, taking advantage of the beach along their very narrow strip of land, somehow like unoccupied citizens, there was always that looming shadow of recurring attacks, of constant prohibition of movement across the border for important things like medical care, accepting a scholarship abroad, visiting relatives in the West Bank or elsewhere, or simply having a holiday in a new location without the need to beg for permission, often declined. And keep in mind again that Gaza is a very small territory for 2 million people, 1.5 million of them Palestine refugees. Imagine a territory on the face of it ruled, but contradictorily, not controlled by its own elected government, with freedom of movement inside its externally defined territory, free speech to a certain extent, free choice to a much more limited extent, but confined within this narrow space where all of these freedoms, in fact, are determined, or at least affected, I could say dictated, by the same hostile neighbor. Life is very uncertain under such circumstances, and while Gazans make the best of it for the sake of their families, one can understand they often become very upset and very angry and wanting to protest when these very freedoms enjoyed by the occupiers are denied, and that explains the march to the border every week. Not only is individual travel subject to permission from next door, I use this phrase deliberately, as the activities of this controlling neighbor are there in plain sight all the time, but the amount of goods which allow a civilized life are also controlled to the calorie, the gallon, the yard, etc. Yet Gazans make the most of the opportunities offered to them. If granted permission, usually after multiple applications and long waits to cross the border for serious purposes, as I've mentioned already, medical, education, business, to visit ailing relatives, for example, there will still be interminable waits at the so-called border and a long trek by foot to reach the Israeli officer who's going to eventually open the gates and let you out. Again, this has become a tolerated way of life. What choice do they have right now? Grocers and shopkeepers who must apply for permission to bring limited supplies into their shops, doctors in a hospital that do the same for their patients, entrepreneurs who try to keep their businesses going, but always fearful of an ever more restricted list of permitted goods, of late deliveries, of last-minute refusals, including of previously approved goods that have arrived at the border. I could go on, but you get the picture. Trying to live what you believe, even know, as we've already heard, what is normal, but subjected to decisions you cannot protest or reject to allow that freedom of travel, decision, and demand, applying in a prescribed but dignified manner to be allowed to bring in medicines your relatives need, or the foodstuffs so that your grocery business can thrive, or the chance to leave Gaza for a scholarship, to visit these ailing relatives I've already mentioned, even in the West Bank, or to accept a job abroad. Surprising to me at first, and later simply a matter of respect and wonder, was the positive adaptation to living under occupation that most Gazans had, most of the time. How they kept a cheerful, or at least an uncomplaining attitude while facing this constant but unpredictable impositions on what must be considered normal elsewhere. Parents deserve enormous respect as they, again, outwardly, cheerfully, made sure their children were in school, impeccably dressed and totally prepared for each day, usually with smiles on their faces. Particular thanks are due to the teachers who met their responsibilities and meet their responsibilities as if they're living as normal teachers, unburdened by the specter of anything untoward or challenging that could occur at any time and had to be overcome while living under the edicts and interference of a hostile and powerful neighbor, and who determined how many and which books you could order, and how much paper and how many pens you and your students needed. So far, I've been describing life under the quiet times, not those when usually for reasons not easy to understand or comprehend, the violence would erupt in the form of aerial bombing from next door. Then all bets were off, as they say. Everyone hunkered down, hoping to avoid being wounded or losing a home or a farm or a relative. Events and the environment grew gradually more difficult during my decade in Gaza, and even more since I've left. More and more severe restrictions were imposed on the movement of people and goods, attacks that had been non-existent when I first arrived, when everyday life could be counted on to follow a certain restricted pattern. Throughout it all, however, Gazans stayed calm and carried on, if I may quote a slogan that pertains to other threatening but less threatening environments. This is more amazing, remembering from years ago how my staff, who, aside from a handful of dedicated expatriates, were almost entirely all Gazans, got up in the morning, they went to work, they did as much as they could, willingly, enthusiastically, to provide the education and health and other social services that UNRWA was empowered by the international community to offer to Gazans behind this artificially defined and observed border. Having endeavored to paint a realistic picture of Gaza and Gazans during the time, my relatively livable decade among them, I hope I've also conveyed my admiration and gratitude for how they showed and still show until today, God bless them, when conditions are considerably more difficult than then, that a beleaguered people can keep up their spirits, can get up each day to struggle with the difficulties imposed by an occupation, sometimes to the extent of causing injuries and deaths, always causing disappointment and frustration. If I may venture modestly to explain their spirit, I believe, we've heard some about it, we'll hear more, it's at least partially because they know their cause is just. They never forget or forgive or give up on the past or what they insist will be their future. Palestinians around the world, as we hear it today, have shown great patience in holding on to their determination to have a state and a territory of their own under their full control, after these have been continually encroached upon and denied to them for decades. Still, they carry on around the world, but most seriously in the occupied territory, Gaza, the West Bank, and Jerusalem, and also in Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, standing firm, defending, and fighting for the legitimate goals for which they've been struggling for decades. Lucky and grateful am I for having been able to spend 10 years in the occupied territory, leaving reluctantly, but with a new inspired view of what life and family and home mean. And thanks to the spirit and the determination of the Palestinian people and the strength and righteousness of the Palestinian cause, I, with many others, continue to look forward to that day when justice will have its day in the Middle East and the Palestinians will live free. Thank you. I was going to say, since people were mentioning their families and their families' children's name and so on, the Abu Zaid comes from my Sudanese husband, and my older son is named Yasser, and my younger son is Haitham. So.
Thank you so much, Karen. It's a wonderful tour d'horizon. Our third speaker is Rachel Evans, who is the director of the legal department of UNRWA. Luckily, she has a whole slew of degrees and international law experience, but I can hardly think of any other job in which being the legal chief would be so challenging as in dealing with Israel in this situation. Rachel, please.
So, distinguished guests, I'm delighted to be here in the company of all of you, including our former and most esteemed Commissioner General, Ms. Karen Abu Zaid. This is indeed an honor for me. We haven't met, but I have heard so much about your legacy, and I respect you and salute you. UNRWA at 70 requires a necessary reflection, and I'm here on behalf of UNRWA to offer some humble perspectives on 70 years of existence, achievements, challenges, and outlooks. So I hope you'll bear with me. I'll try and stick to my 15 minutes, and it's hard to zone in on exactly what to say, but I have thought about what perhaps would be most useful for this audience. And I'm assuming you have quite a good knowledge of UNRWA, so I won't go into all of the underlying details, but I will remind all that we were mandated to meet humanitarian and human development needs of Palestine refugees pending a just and durable solution. Our continuing existence represents the ongoing needs that Palestine refugees have as a result of the lack of a political solution to their plight. Sometimes it's said that UNRWA prolongs the refugee problem. This is inaccurate. UNRWA exists as a function of the lack of a political solution and the continuing needs as determined by the General Assembly, our parent organ. Palestine refugees remain refugees for as long as their situation is not resolved. When the agency started to operate in 1950, it was responding to the needs of approximately 750,000 displaced Palestine refugees who settled where they could, thinking that displacement was temporary and that they would return soon. Many still hold the keys to their homes. Today, more than 5 million Palestine refugees are eligible for UNRWA services within the key areas of our operations. As you all know, our geographical mandate includes 5 fields, and the Near East, which is in our title, so Jordan, Lebanon, Syrian Arabic Republic, West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. Nearly 1/3 of Palestine refugees, more than 1.5 million individuals, are registered as living in 58 recognized refugee camps. The responsibility of the camps is limited for UNRWA in that we provide services, but we do not own, administer, or police the camps, which is the responsibility of the host governments. The remaining 2/3 of Palestine refugees live in and around the cities and towns of the host countries, and in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, often in the environs of the camps. While most of our installations and schools are located in the camps, a number are outside the camps. The agency Human Development and Humanitarian Services, as you know, encompass education, healthcare, relief, social services, camp infrastructure and improvement, microfinance, emergency assistance, including in terms of armed conflict. I won't go into detail on each of these services, but maybe some key statistics will assist you. For example, UNRWA provides free universal primary education to more than 500,000 refugee children. We have more than 711 schools, providing a measure of stability and perspective to these children. This contributes directly to their human rights and to ensure that they enjoy a measure of human dignity. We also have vocational centers and education and science facilities. Health. We offer preventative and curative health services to approximately 3.1 million refugees through more than 140 health clinics. UNRWA Healthcare carry out about 8.5 million visits a year. This is a significant service. We provide relief and social services. Of the some 5 million Palestine refugees, it's estimated that 1.2 million live in absolute poverty. 700,000 of them live in abject poverty, unable to meet even the most basic of needs. We have a microfinance department, which is alive and kicking and an extremely interesting program, providing sustainable income-generating opportunities for Palestine refugees, as well as other poor and marginalized groups who live and work near them. We have provided to date more than 437,000 loans to assist, and in particular, the recipients of the loans, the majority of women, receive them with 100% repayment credibility. We have UNRWA camp and infrastructure programs which work towards a safe and healthy urban environment to Palestine refugees, whether it's to ensure safe drinking water, waste removal services, stormwater drainage, rodent control services, to avoid the combats of the spread of sanitation and hygiene-related diseases. We also provide shelter, including through schools in emergency times. So some statistics here, because this is a real service. Our teachers in the day become shelter managers at night. For example, in the 2014 conflict, UNRWA housed over 300,000 displaced refugees in Gaza in its schools. We also provide emergency response. And here you have to imagine, again, our staff turn from teachers, doctors, sanitation laborers during the day to emergency response providers at night on the ground. UNRWA does not leave during crisis. It stays and it delivers. Protecting and promoting the lives and the human rights of Palestine refugees under international law is one of our core and prioritized functions. It safeguards and advances the rights of Palestine refugees through the direct provision of services and advocacy activities. We have been a strong advocate for the protection and promotion of the rights of Palestine refugees. This has included on the negative consequences of the occupation in the occupied Palestinian territories, the blockade on the Gaza Strip, the impact of the Syrian conflict on Palestine refugees, and we document alleged human rights violations, and we have a duty to bring these to the attention of the duty bearers and the international human rights system. Through protection interventions, UNRWA addresses the root causes of abuse and neglect of beneficiary rights and highlights the urgent need for a just and durable solution to the plight of Palestine refugees. And for this work, we are continually attacked. I thought it would be useful, because I knew Karen would be reflecting on the decade up to 2010, to consider regional and operational developments in our environment in the decade between 2010 and now. To give some understanding to the intense, challenging operating environment in which we operate, and to fully appreciate the sheer unsustainability of the situation of Palestine refugees in overall human terms, from social and economic perspectives to the dimension of human rights, security, and dignity. Trends over the last decade have become even bleaker. Over the last decade, it started with the so-called Arab Spring, which created a space and an opportunity for expression of civil and political rights. But it also produced challenges and dangers, political upheavals or unrest, which created tensions in all of our areas of operation. Refugees, in addition to the heavy burden of protracted and unresolved exile, are facing the challenges of this social and economic change. This has brought regional tensions, impediments to peace and sustainable development. So if we reflect on the proximity talks and the fragile hopes that it engendered when they were eclipsed by the tragic events on the high seas on the morning of the 31st of May, 2010. These events were a painful reminder of the nature of occupation of Palestine lands in general and the closure of Gaza's borders in particular. And this particular event illustrated the dire consequences of the international community's collective failure to achieve a negotiated solution to the conflict and to enforce and ensure respect for international law across the region. We have seen global financial uncertainty, which cast a shadow on the economic prospects of major donor states, which constrain their capacity to respond to UNRWA's needs as generously and as urgently as the situation demanded. And in turn, we saw increasing pressure on UNRWA to streamline expenditure, maximize cost efficiencies, impacting the quality and breadth of our services, resulting in a regional anxiety about what do these trends mean and imply for the prospects of UNRWA's presence and role. Successive financial crises have plagued the agency over the last decade. In 2018, we faced the biggest challenge ever in the history of the agency following the defunding of our biggest donor, the United States, first by reducing their contribution by $300 million and then increasing this year by $360. This left us with a deficit of minus $446 million US out of an operating budget of 1.2 billion. This was the greatest predicament, financial terms, facing the agency. And the convergence of this crisis with the lack of tangible progress in the political sphere, especially in respect of refugees, was extremely and remains extremely troubling. We saw the increasing risks of the size of the shortfalls. I was saying to Karen earlier when I was reflecting upon this speech and looking at through the old documentation, financial crisis has been a continuing element of UNRWA, but it has spiked and it is becoming more serious. And the possibility we faced and continue to face right now as we speak, with need to close the funding gap to the end of this year, was to postpone the opening of schools for our 530,000 children. And this is a serious stress for the community. education through UNRWA is one of the most stabilizing factors in the region. Imagine 530,000 kids without education, with no alternative. The increasing sizes of the shortfalls and the risks were extreme and remain extreme. Since the 2010 conflict, or the consequences thereof, we are engulfed and all 5 areas of operations are impacted. We saw the outbreak of the Syrian conflict over this decade, where Palestinians who had long enjoyed a range of stable social and economic rights. For over 6 decades, these communities had created lives, raised families, developed livelihoods in a welcoming and relatively stable environment. However, they now face increasing poverty, growing insecurity, and further displacement, which have been devastating blows. We witnessed 2 significant conflicts in Gaza in 2012 and 2014. Focusing on 2014, let's remember the statistics, and I don't have the names with me of each of those who suffered. I tried to get them because UNRWA has a tradition of not just saying statistics without names. But in 2014, 1,500 civilians, including 538 children and 306 women, were killed. Some 1,500 children were orphaned. 11,000 people were injured, including 1,000 children who to this day remain with a variety of disabilities. This is what we faced in the last 10 years. And the real problems, as we've heard, underlying the crisis in Gaza remain unresolved. In particular, the many calls to end the illegal Israeli blockade remain unanswered. The population of Gaza, including more than 1 million Palestinian refugees, have no reason to envisage a better future than the one projected in the UN's Gaza 2020 report, which paints a bleak picture of the Strip's infrastructure, natural resources, economy, and people's welfare, and more disturbing, the epidemic deterioration in psychosocial conditions, creating the basis for catastrophic future developments. In 2010, we saw a bit of improvement in Lebanon, or at least we hoped for it, where there were potential laws amending the labor laws to provide employment opportunities for Palestinians. However, unfortunately, there's been no implementation of these amendments to date, and only this year we've seen further concerning developments in respect of announcements of restrictions on labor laws and permits for Palestinian refugees. Without these opportunities, there is very little horizon, and Palestinian refugees in Lebanon are some of the most vulnerable. They continue to live in some of the worst conditions of refugees in the region. This decade saw the 50th anniversary of the Israeli occupation of Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, the continuing blockade of Gaza, the illegal but relentless settlement expansion, continued to destroy the ability of Palestinians with any hope of building a productive and peaceful future. In the West Bank, we saw the familiar pattern of systematic violations of human rights, continued unabated, in spite of international appeals for Israel to stop creating facts on the ground that jeopardize the peace efforts. Overall socio-economic conditions in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, continue to deteriorate for Palestine refugees, with systematic restrictions on the movement of persons and their conduct of trade, causing widespread poverty and unemployment, including in the 19 refugee camps. In this decade, we saw the blockade become entrenched. As a direct consequence, poverty and food insecurity grew. UNRWA has a major responsibility for the welfare of 2/3 of the population of Gaza. And from that perspective, it's clear that Gaza, over the last decade, has become close to uninhabitable, and that further conflict, bound as before to affect civilians, will erupt unless its causes are addressed. The unsustainability in Gaza has been measured by the continued downward spiral that the population of the Strip is confronted with. Refugees needing food assistance. This statistic is shocking. In 2010, 80,000 Palestine refugees relied on food assistance. In 2019, it's over 1.1 million refugees relying on food aid from UNRWA. They have nowhere to go, and unemployment is over 50%. For the youth, it's over 65%, and for women, it's over 80%. These are people, by the way, who wish to work, who are educated, who have skills. These are people today receiving food assistance, who a few years ago ran factories and employed people, now relying on food baskets. Lebanon and Jordan continue to pay a heavy price for regional insecurity, and the conflict in Syria in particular. We use every opportunity at UNRWA to pay tribute to the hospitality of Lebanon and Jordan and emphasize the need of the international community to support both countries. As we heard, we saw the move of the US Embassy to Jerusalem that caused strong reactions and anxieties. We saw a rise in attempts, as we heard, to delegitimize UNRWA and Palestine refugees, including a recent announcement by the government of Israel of a policy to replace UNRWA services in East Jerusalem, contrary to international law, including the rights enshrined in the Fourth Geneva Convention. We saw the so-called Great March of Return, an extensive violence in already traumatized Gaza, with many killed and thousands injured. And this situation is greatly underestimated by the world. More people were injured in about 10 days of mostly peaceful demonstrations than during the 50-day attack and all-out war in 2014. Being exposed to danger and hardship has been the daily routine in this decade. Palestine refugees remain vulnerable, and this vulnerability increases, as happens with refugee communities all over the world when they are exposed to shock of conflict. But I must dwell for a moment on the broader challenges, and we heard some reference to them today. So funding challenge I've expressed, it's clear, and with some exceptions, UNRWA relies on voluntary contributions. To perform our mandate, we need 1.2 billion a year. Our current deficit lies at 167 million, and we're in November. And that is a very restrictive budget. 167 million still means that we have to postpone vendor payments. We have to take SURF loans from the international OCHA facility, and so on. It's a very minimal amount and will not resolve all the issues. Okay. We've seen all kinds of other attempts to delegitimize UNRWA, and they were referred to today, whether it's the definition of Palestine refugees, the issue in relation to descendants, The offhand comment that it should be so easy to merge UNRWA and UNHCR without any absolute thought on the difference of the two agencies and the ridiculousness of that suggestion. We see attacks on the generational status when all refugees around the world pass status down to their descendants. We've seen protracted situations in Afghanistan, Angola, and all kinds of other countries. And the right of return, which is a fundamental right for all refugees, enshrines in GA resolutions. I'm being told I need to wrap up. I have too much to say, and perhaps during the day I can say more. What I would like to highlight, though, is during this decade, UNRWA has achieved monumental achievements that are not always heard because we're not very good at PRing ourselves. What we do is spend a lot of time reacting to the attacks, which are many. But we have made leaps and bounds in areas of cost efficiencies, in programmatic reforms in relief and social services, education and relief, or education and health systems. Our microfinance program has received endless awards. We have been innovative in our funding, seeking alternative solutions. Last year alone, more than 40 countries stepped up to the mark to bridge the funding gap. And if I may, with a short conclusion, why are we still relevant? We have 2 million students who have passed through UNRWA schools over the decades since 1950. We have, in the last decade, delivered 86 million medical consultations. We take 23,000 patients every day in our clinics. We provide shelter. We provide livelihoods. And I would like to conclude by reminding ourselves that the strength of UNRWA and its value to the international community are inextricably linked to the significance of refugees as a distinct constituency of the Palestinian body politic. We make an essential contribution to their well-being and dignity, and therefore enhance the value of Palestinian human capital. This is an organization that has seen a lot over 7 decades. It's seen the pain firsthand and the injustice. It has also seen achievements. And despite the extreme adversity, we are an agile, extraordinarily nimble, and resilient organization operating in one of the world's most polarized environments. At 70, we are an illustration of what can and in many ways has been achieved for Palestine refugees. But we are a living reminder of what happens when no political solutions are found to address the underlying causes of historic injustice. At the heart of dignity and the plight of Palestine refugees is an unresolved conflict, an ongoing occupation, and a lasting injustice. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Extremely comprehensive. I'm sorry I had to raise the red flag there. I would just like to take guidance from, shall we do the film now, although we're running so late? Yes. Okay, so now we have a short film from Canada, from Professor Michael Lynch, who, as you know, is the Special Rapporteur, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights, following Richard Falk. So we can play that now, please.
Good morning. It is my great pleasure and honor to have been asked to be part of this important and timely conference. For reasons that I will mention in a minute, UNRWA is an institution that is very close to my heart. First of all, may I beg forgiveness from all of you for not being able to join you in person as much as I wanted to be there. My current teaching schedule is a very demanding master, which must be obeyed. With regret, I know that I am missing a great opportunity to meet the very distinguished speakers who will be presenting today, as well as those of you in the audience. My best wishes to all of you for a very successful conference. Before I begin my formal remarks, can I say to you that one of my very earliest formative experiences respecting Palestine, Israel, and the occupation was thanks to UNRWA. As a young lawyer, I joined UNRWA in 1989 at the height of the first Palestinian Intifada to serve as what was known in those days as a Refugee Affairs Officer. The Refugee Affairs Officer program arose as part of the growing responsibility of UNRWA in the 1980s to provide for the legal and human rights of Palestinian refugees, as directed by the General Assembly. It was designed to monitor, intervene, and raise complaints about Israel's mistreatment of Palestinian refugees in the OPT during this uprising. For 6 months as a Refugee Affairs Officer, I traveled continuously up and down the West Bank with the other RAOs, visiting all of the 19 refugee camps on a frequent basis, trying to instill a sense among the camp inhabitants that the international community was paying attention to their well-being. As part of our duties, we would observe the regular clashes between the camp inhabitants and the Israeli army, watch rocks from one side and bullets and tear gas from the other side being exchanged, and sometimes ferry young, badly wounded Palestinians from the camps to a hospital or a health clinic. It was an unusual privilege to have been part of this unique fly-on-the-wall of history experience. More than anything, my short time with UNRWA in the West Bank instilled within me an intense personal curiosity about the peoples and the politics of the region. This would later turn into a legal scholar's professional interest in the occupation, as well as in the fate and the future of the millions of Palestinian refugees that the agency has provided such vital services for over the decades. In the short time that I have, I want to discuss 5 issues and put them in the context of international law, the occupation, and the human rights of the Palestinian refugees, keeping in mind the rights of the more than 2 million refugees in the occupied Palestinian territory. My first point has to do with the reasons for the creation of UNRWA 70 years ago. In the midst of the 1947-49 war, which led to the creation of Israel and the dispossession and exile of approximately 720,000 Palestinians, the United Nations General Assembly adopted Resolution 194 in December 1948. In paragraph 11 of the resolution, the General Assembly called for 3 things. First, the refugees who wish to return to their homes and live at peace with their neighbors should be allowed to do so at the earliest possible date. Second, for those who chose not to return home, they should receive compensation for their lost properties. And thirdly, this should all be done in accordance with international law and equity. The day before Resolution 194 was adopted, the General Assembly voted in favor of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In the Declaration, which is still the world's most noble and important proclamation on human rights, the General Assembly stated that everyone has the right to leave and return to one's country. They all have the right to nationality, and they have the right to seek asylum. These core rights of the Declaration have subsequently entered into international law. These rights apply equally to the millions of Palestinian refugees still living in exile, maintaining for them the right to return as a solemn individual right. In the context of all this, and with the refusal of Israel to allow the Palestinian refugees to return home, UNRWA was created by the United Nations in 1949. Its creation was the acknowledgement by the international community that until the terms of Resolution 194 could be satisfied, the United Nations was to continue to provide assistance to the Palestinian refugees to address their desperate plight. As the American legal scholar Susan Akram has stated, UNRWA remains the main guarantor of the survival of Palestinian refugees in the Arab host states and the main symbol of the international commitment and responsibility towards them. My second point is that the question of Palestine was and remains the most international of international conflicts. It was the international community through the United Nations which partitioned Mandate Palestine, leading to the creation of the Palestinian refugee problem. Since then, the United Nations has cared for the millions of Palestinian refugees over the past 70 years. It has overseen numerous and unsuccessful peace proposals. It has been the diplomatic cockpit when wars have broken out, and it remains the principal international political forum for the declaration of the rights and obligations that apply to the conflict and the occupation. Consequently, The only just and durable solution to the question of Palestine must be a comprehensive solution which addresses all of the outstanding issues within the framework of international law, including the rights of the 5 million Palestinian refugees. The ultimate solution, be it a genuine two-state solution, a single democratic state, or some other durable and fair settlement, has to satisfy the obligations of international law and the international consensus on this issue. This is our barometer, our fundamental guide to a morally and politically based, rights-based solution, which understands and encompasses the fact that Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs have a shared future together, and it must be based on equality and justice for all. My third point is that the same rules on the rights of refugees everywhere to a durable solution also apply equally to the Palestinian refugees. Globally, the three accepted durable solutions are: 1, voluntary return to one's home country, or 2, integration into the host country, or 3, resettlement into a third country. Whenever there will be a proposal for the final settlement of the Palestinian refugee issue, these choices must be before the refugees, and they must be able to freely decide individually which option they would prefer. This choice must be theirs and theirs alone, and cannot be abrogated by anyone else. My fourth point is to pay tribute to the valiant work performed by UNRWA over the past 7 decades. In the face of regional political instability, catastrophic wars, perpetual budget crises, a sometimes hostile international environment, and a rapidly growing refugee problem, UNRWA has accomplished an extraordinary amount in the face of all these challenges. The administration of over 700 schools, the delivery of local health care and multiple public health campaigns, the consistent upgrading of water, sanitation, and power utility services, and the employment of thousands and thousands of Palestinians. These are remarkable accomplishments by any standards. None of this is meant to airbrush the problems that are internal to UNRWA. Anyone who has worked with UNRWA or closely observed its operations will acknowledge that there is always more to be done and that there are mistakes to be addressed and answered. But when honestly evaluating the positive and the negative attributes of the agency, and separate those from the rote criticisms made of UNRWA's work by those who are inherently hostile to its mandate, one can conclude that it has done a lot with very little. My fifth and final point is to push back against some of the international arguments that dissolving UNRWA would be a positive step in breaking the logjam that is preventing a final solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In my mind, nothing could be further from the political truth or the legal obligation. Pushing for the dismantlement of UNRWA as part of the solution is like saying that getting rid of food banks would solve our problems of poverty and inequality. Rather, the obligation rests with Israel and with the international community to implement the just and durable solutions for this population. These solutions must be rights-based, and they must be consistent with humanitarian and human rights obligations. The UN General Assembly annually adopts a resolution pertaining to the Palestinian refugee issue. Each resolution in recent years calls for a just solution to the issue. It is my view that such a solution must encompass the right to return for those who wish to exercise it, a right to compensation, and a right to restitution. Accompanying this must be a viable and practical plan for enabling the refugees to achieve a viable future that contributes to a broader, shared, and prosperous future for all of those in the region. Achieving this won't be easy, and it will require a multi-state, multi-level effort and plenty of lifting power by the international community. But nothing short of this will achieve the future that everybody in the region, and especially the dispossessed Palestinian refugees, deserve. Thank you very much, and my best wishes for a successful conference.
Well, that was a very terrific tour d'horizon by Michael Lynch. I'm so sorry he's not with us. I'm sure many of you would have loved to question him. We've now been allowed a few more minutes, so we have nearly 15 minutes of questions. There is a roving mic. So can I see some hands raised so I can see? Okay, let's take the two at the back there, and the one here on my right. We'll take them together, and then our panel will answer. Two at the back, one on each side.
Good morning, everybody. I consider myself a success story from UNRWA. I was born and raised in Palestinian refugee camp, and I left it around 3 months ago. I'm studying now, doing master's here. The Palestinian refugee camp is in Jordan, Souf camp. So I am a success story for UNRWA, so I will be always thankful. But when I left, there was a strike for the teachers in the schools in Jordan, on UNRWA schools. And there is cut funding, so there are many concerns in north of Jordan camps, Palestinian camps. So what is the UNRWA plans for the next strikes for the teachers? Because it's a huge number of students who are depending on the UNRWA schools in Jordan. So this is my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the lady in the second row to the back, I think it was. Or has that person disappeared? Okay, let's take the one. There's another one that side. Take that one.
Thank you very much for the wonderful presentations. My question is to Rachel Evers. Can you comment, if, God forbid, that UNRWA will be integrated with UNHCR, what will be the differences in the protection function of UNRWA and UNHCR for the Palestinian refugees? Thank you.
Thank you. Let's take the second row here.
Hello, Khalid Nadeem, South Asia Middle East Forum. Thank you for your presentations. The Palestinian cause is a cause very close to my heart. Last year my father died, and before he died he said to me, he said, Khalid, I know you're trying to do all sorts of things. Which things would you put at the top of your agenda? And one of the things I put at the top of my agenda was Kashmir and the Palestinian issue. Now, I'm deeply concerned about opportunities for Palestinians under 30. I'm at the moment preparing an event on the impact of the Syrian refugee crisis on Lebanon. Whilst preparing that, I've seen some of the problems facing Palestinians, refugees. I really am disappointed in the Gulf states that they could bring a lot more to the table. I think they should institute, I'm talking about UAE, Saudi Arabia and Qatar. This is a message I'm sending to the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, MBS, and to the Emir of Qatar, and to Sheikh Maktoum of UAE. You really have to help your Palestinian brothers, and I think you've been forgetting them. You need to institute a Marshall Plan, and I think a Marshall Plan of a minimum of $2 billion. Also, you need to think about taking some of the young Palestinians from Jordan and Palestine into your countries. I'm not saying taking a lot, but maybe say initially 10,000 Palestinian students, the most able students, and train them and give them jobs in your respective countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll ask Rachel to respond to the first of two questions and Hassan to the third.
Hello, is that working? So the first question in relation to the strikes in Jordan and the concerns in the camps and our plans in the future. So I presume you're referring to the recent strikes that took place amongst government employees in Jordan, mainly teachers from the educational part of the Ministry of Education. During that strike, UNRWA teachers remained in schools. They did not join the strike. However, the impact of the resolution of the negotiated settlement by the government of Jordan with the teachers has a direct impact on UNRWA. And the reason for that is that UNRWA traditionally, and I'm not sure, but perhaps Karen knows better than me, has aligned itself to the host government salaries in civil service. Remember, UNRWA employees do not follow the UN national staff protocols. They are underpaid compared to the UN system and traditionally been aligned with the host government civil service salaries. So when host governments undertake salary reviews and increase their salaries according to very technical pay policy reviews, UNRWA, under its own internal pay policy review system, has agreed to match so that our staff remain on the comparator with the host governments. So recently, after the conclusion of the strike in Jordan, we were faced with a strike in our HQ and our Jordan field office, with staff demanding the same comparator. And we have systems which oblige us to undertake these reviews and to ensure that in that review, none of our staff remain below the comparator. And this is something that is difficult in times of financial challenge, because of course, once you do the review, you will find certain categories of staff that may be under the comparator and require increases. And the fact is, this is the cost of labor, okay? When that happens at a time of increased financial difficulty, it's hard for us, because on the one hand, you have the moral obligation of increasing salaries according to the comparator, and on the other hand, you're facing significant financial deficits. So the two are very hard to bridge. But the moral and ethical obligation is there, and it's up to UNRWA to try and find the funding, and it's also for our donors and partners to recognize that these are pressures that we can't just continually say no to. And you have some examples across the region of this. For example, in Syria.
Sorry, I'm going to have to stop you there. But please note that you'll be able to talk to Rachel all day. And I'll say that also, if you don't mind, for the second question.
Yeah, I mean,
because we'd like to take one more round of questions after this. But
I'll be quick on the UNHCR question, if you like, because I think it's a relevant one.
It's very quick.
Yeah. I mean, this has been one of the increased attacks on UNRWA, that it should be easy to combine the two agencies. One, the two agencies were set up in the same year in 1949 for a reason. They both provide very different services. UNRWA is a direct implementer on the ground. UNHCR provides protection and assistance. There is no ability to align the two agencies.
Well, the question about the Arab world, Khalid, and thank you for your passion. Of course, we need more support from our brothers and sisters in the Arab world. But I have two main points to make here. First, the support that we really need is not to accept more Palestinians in Gulf countries. We need the Gulf countries and the Arab world to help Palestinians stay and withstand and survive. We need Arab support, political and financial, to really help our people in Jerusalem, who are the heroes, the real heroes, every single morning, every evening. And they are in need of help. And Jerusalem, of course, is our national hub and is our national capital, but Jerusalem goes beyond us. We need their help with the increasing settlements and our ability in the West Bank to actually challenge these colonial cancerous settlements. We need their help in Gaza and the end of this blockade that has been happening. We need their help in many arenas, including disengaging from the occupier economically, and that's why we have been visiting Arab capitals all along.
I'm sorry to be so mean, but I would just like to very quickly, if we've got to, well, I know we've got one question over there, and and then the lady, these two ladies here. But please make them very quick questions. Okay, one.
Thank you for all the speakers. I'll try to make this quick. I'm kind of in two minds about this, so consider it like a devil's advocate question, maybe. But I'm a Palestinian refugee from Lebanon. I was born there, studied in UNRWA schools. My dad is a teacher in an UNRWA school until today. So I've very much benefited, and my entire family is still benefiting from UNRWA. But do you not think that, in a way, UNRWA makes us complacent in that there's some Palestinian refugees here, give them some basic rights, and then kind of shut up about the whole right of return thing? Do you not think that the UNRWA should be pushing more about pushing for Palestinians to go back instead of kind of just trying to let them settle in the refugee camps where they are?
Thank you. The problem with the questions is they're all so interesting we could go on for hours. But the lady in the orange scarf and the lady just in front of you.
Another question for Rachel, who's being somewhat deluged. I apologise for that. I was speaking with a friend in Borj al-Barajni camp in Beirut yesterday, and I'm wondering, at a time of shortfall, what the escalating economic crisis in Lebanon at the moment means. The situation in the camps is becoming severe, and they are approaching a humanitarian crisis there. So I'm wondering, where there is still salinated water, there is no fresh drinking water. They all have to buy their drinking water. So I'm just wondering what happens in an emergency situation when you're suffering as you are with the shortfall.
Hello, thank you for the speech. I am Palestinian, also refugee from Lebanon. For Mr. Hussam, right to return is for us Lebanese and Palestinians in Lebanon is to all Palestine, not 67 for all Palestine, from the river to the sea. And this is from my grandparents, and I will be also inheriting it to my sons and to my daughters. Second question, you have spoken. It's a comment, but I needed to say it. My question, you speak about the suffering of Palestinians, which we do all know. But how do you see the role of Palestinians? As they do have agency and they do have the power and the knowledge and the skills. How UNRWA can be using the Palestinians people, Palestinians community to move forward, especially in a very hostile environment like Lebanon, Syria, and unfortunately Jordan as well. So what's the role of the community, Palestinians people like me and the beautiful guy there from Lebanon as well? Thank you.
Okay, I think these. I'm going to take my chairman's prerogative to end on time, thanking the three speakers. But I think the second speaker already, Rachel answered that as best she possibly could. And I think you can kind of have to accept that. But I think particularly the last speaker is a very, very good moment for us to move on. And sorry, Ambassador, but it is good to have a lady who says exactly what you've been saying. Give Palestinians agency. Thank you.
She answered.
Thank you, everybody, very much. Can you please be back here at 11:30?
لندن 30 من نوفمبر 2019. في الذكرى 70 لتأسيسها، رغم تعرض وكالة الأونروا للاستهداف من قبل إسرائيل وقطع التمويل الأمريكي، فإنها لا تزال تؤدي عملها. ما هو الدور المنتظر منها في مساعدة اللاجئين الفلسطينيين؟ وهل لا يزال يعول عليها في نضال اللاجئين من أجل عودتهم إلى ديارهم؟ الأونروا تحديات الاستجابة للأزمات والسعي نحو بناء مستقبل عادل. مؤتمر بحثي ينظمه مركز الجزيرة للدراسات ومركز العودة الفلسطيني بالاشتراك مع المركز الأوروبي للدراسات الفلسطينية بجامعة إكستر البريطانية. لندن 30 من نوفمبر 2019. في الذكرى 70 لتأسيسها، رغم تعرض وكالة الأونروا للاستهداف من قبل إسرائيل وقطع التمويل الأمريكي، فإنها لا تزال تؤدي عملها. ما هو الدور المنتظر منها في مساعدة اللاجئين الفلسطينيين؟ وهل لا يزال يعول عليها في نضال اللاجئين من أجل عودتهم إلى ديارهم؟ الأونروا تحديات الاستجابة للأزمات والسعي نحو بناء مستقبل عادل. مؤتمر بحثي ينظمه مركز الجزيرة للدراسات ومركز العودة الفلسطيني بالاشتراك مع المركز الأوروبي للدراسات الفلسطينية بجامعة إكستر البريطانية. لندن، 30 من نوفمبر 2019. في الذكرى 70 لتأسيسها، رغم تعرض وكالة الأونروا للاستهداف من قبل إسرائيل وقطع التمويل الأمريكي، فإنها لا تزال تؤدي عملها. ما هو الدور المنتظر منها في مساعدة اللاجئين الفلسطينيين؟ وهل لا يزال يعول عليها في نضال اللاجئين من أجل عودتهم إلى ديارهم؟ الأونروا تحديات الاستجابة للأزمات والسعي نحو بناء مستقبل عادل. مؤتمر بحثي ينظمه مركز الجزيرة للدراسات ومركز العودة الفلسطيني بالاشتراك مع المركز الأوروبي للدراسات الفلسطينية بجامعة إكستر البريطانية. لندن، 30 من نوفمبر 2019. في الذكرى 70 لتأسيسها، رغم تعرض وكالة الأونروا للاستهداف من قبل إسرائيل وقطع التمويل الأمريكي، فإنها لا تزال تؤدي عملها. ما هو الدور المنتظر منها في مساعدة اللاجئين الفلسطينيين؟ وهل لا يزال يعول عليها في نضال اللاجئين من أجل عودتهم إلى ديارهم؟ الأونروا تحديات الاستجابة للأزمات والسعي نحو بناء مستقبل عادل. مؤتمر بحثي ينظمه مركز الجزيرة للدراسات ومركز العودة الفلسطيني بالاشتراك مع المركز الأوروبي للدراسات الفلسطينية بجامعة إكستر البريطانية. لندن، 30 من نوفمبر 2019. في الذكرى 70 لتأسيسها، رغم تعرض وكالة الأونروا للاستهداف من قبل إسرائيل وقطع التمويل الأمريكي، فإنها لا تزال تؤدي عملها. ما هو الدور المنتظر منها في مساعدة اللاجئين الفلسطينيين؟ وهل لا يزال يعول عليها في نضال اللاجئين من أجل عودتهم إلى ديارهم؟ الأونروا تحديات الاستجابة للأزمات والسعي نحو بناء مستقبل عادل. مؤتمر بحثي ينظمه مركز الجزيرة للدراسات ومركز العودة الفلسطيني بالاشتراك مع المركز الأوروبي للدراسات الفلسطينية بجامعة إكستر البريطانية. لندن، 30 من نوفمبر 2019. في الذكرى 70 لتأسيسها، رغم تعرض وكالة الأونروا للاستهداف من قبل إسرائيل وقطع التمويل الأمريكي، فإنها لا تزال تؤدي عملها. ما هو الدور المنتظر منها في مساعدة اللاجئين الفلسطينيين؟ وهل لا يزال يعول عليها في نضال اللاجئين من أجل عودتهم إلى ديارهم؟ الأونروا تحديات الاستجابة للأزمات والسعي نحو بناء مستقبل عادل. مؤتمر بحثي ينظمه مركز الجزيرة للدراسات ومركز العودة الفلسطيني بالاشتراك مع المركز الأوروبي للدراسات الفلسطينية بجامعة إكستر البريطانية. لندن، 30 من نوفمبر 2019. في الذكرى 70 لتأسيسها، رغم تعرض وكالة الأونروا للاستهداف من قبل إسرائيل وقطع التمويل الأمريكي، فإنها لا تزال تؤدي عملها. ما هو الدور المنتظر منها في مساعدة اللاجئين الفلسطينيين؟ وهل لا يزال يعول عليها في نضال اللاجئين من أجل عودتهم إلى ديارهم؟ الأونروا تحديات الاستجابة للأزمات والسعي نحو بناء مستقبل عادل. مؤتمر بحثي ينظمه مركز الجزيرة للدراسات ومركز العودة الفلسطيني بالاشتراك مع المركز الأوروبي للدراسات الفلسطينية بجامعة إكستر البريطانية. لندن، 30 من نوفمبر 2019. في الذكرى 70 لتأسيسها، رغم تعرض وكالة الأونروا للاستهداف من قبل إسرائيل وقطع التمويل الأمريكي، فإنها لا تزال تؤدي عملها. ما هو الدور المنتظر منها في مساعدة اللاجئين الفلسطينيين؟ وهل لا يزال يعول عليها في نضال اللاجئين من أجل عودتهم إلى ديارهم؟ الأونروا تحديات الاستجابة للأزمات والسعي نحو بناء مستقبل عادل. مؤتمر بحثي
Ben Jamla, I'm the director of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. Just before we start, I've been handed in a pair of glasses, so if anyone's lost some glasses, can they come and fetch those at the end, and we'll keep them up here. So welcome, everyone. Very pleased as director of PSC to be here, and just speaking very briefly in introduction, in my role as director of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, one of the challenges that we face within the solidarity movement is how do we try to establish the right narrative frame of understanding to explain what is happening in Palestine, Israel. More importantly, perhaps, how do we challenge what is still the dominant frame of narrative within mainstream political discourse, one of conflict and territorial dispute, and how do we replace that with a narrative that correctly centers on the story of Palestinian dispossession and of the imposition by Israel of an unjust structure of power that we believe meets the legal definition of apartheid, whether that's imposed upon Palestinians living under military occupation, living as unequal citizens of the state, or living as refugees. So conferences like today that center the story of the Nakba, that are part of the process of what Karma Nalbusi often refers to as the rehistoricizing of Palestine, and that put the refugee experience at the heart, are extremely important, particularly in the climate in which we live, where a central part, of course, of Donald Trump's so-called deal of the century is the assault upon UNRWA, but underpinning that, the support for Israel's attempts to redefine the status of a Palestinian refugee. So I'm very pleased that this conference is taking place and very pleased to be here. As you've heard this morning, we have lost a couple of our panel members. To lose one panel member is unfortunate. Losing two might perhaps be seen as careless. But the positive is it means we can give more focus to the two outstanding experts we have to speak to us. And our theme in this panel is on the complexities and dynamics of the relationship between UNRWA and the Palestinian refugees and how that has evolved over the past 70 years. So I want to move straight away to introducing the first of our two speakers, and I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Anne Erfen. Anne is a departmental lecturer in forced migration at the University of Oxford, where she's part of the Refugee Studies Centre. Her current academic research focuses on UNRWA, Palestinian refugee history, and the origins of the UN's global refugee regime. Would you please welcome Dr. Anne Erfen?
Okay, can everyone hear me? Okay, great. Okay, so good morning, everyone. Thank you for giving up your Saturdays to be here, and thank you very much to the organisers for inviting me to speak today and for suddenly giving me extra time due to the halving of our panel. As Ben said, our panel is focusing on the relationship between UNRWA and Palestinian refugees. My own perspective on this subject comes as a historian. I work on Palestinian refugee history, so I want to really try and historicize this subject and give it that broader perspective in keeping with our focus today, which is obviously looking at UNRWA across 7 decades. Now, the relationship between UNRWA and Palestinian refugees is one that's generally depicted as fraught, right? So these are the kind of images that we're used to seeing in the media depicting reports about the latest Palestinian refugee protests against UNRWA. Usually these types of images will accompany stories concerning protests, demonstrations, rallies, sit-ins, nearly always in response to service cuts and reduction in the provision of UNRWA programs. And accordingly, there has been an increase in this kind of in these kinds of demonstrations and protests in recent years, as UNRWA has found itself increasingly underfunded and overstretched, and has therefore been forced to make even further cuts to its services. That being said, even though it appears to have increased in recent years, some degree of tension between the refugees and UNRWA has been in many ways a continuous feature of the last 7 decades. And so what I'd like to do for the next 15 minutes or so is unpack what's really behind this tension by examining the relationship over its history. And I want to focus in particular on the issue of ownership. So what we might ask, whose agency is UNRWA really? Who does it really belong to? And in terms of UNRWA's structural dynamics, we can see pretty clearly that there are a number of actors who have formal leverage over the agency. So officially, of course, UNRWA is a UN agency. It receives its mandate from the General Assembly. It's also, formally speaking, accountable to the General Assembly. This is where it has to report every year on what progress it's making in implementing its mandate. Financially, however, UNRWA is not dependent on the UNGA, but it's instead reliant entirely on voluntary donations, as we heard from Rachel this morning. And in this sense, it is reliant on funders who have historically nearly always been Western governments, or for the most part have tended to be Western governments over the last 7 decades. The other key actor in logistical terms is, of course, the host states, because UNRWA is unable to perform any of its operations without the cooperation of the host states where it's working. So in terms of UNRWA's structural setup, we can identify all of these actors, but what we don't see here are the Palestinian refugees themselves. Formally speaking, when UNRWA was set up in 1949 and when it started operations in 1950, it really reflected the broader culture of humanitarianism in the mid-20th century, which generally treated refugees as passive recipients rather than active agents in the process. As in keeping with this, the Palestinian refugees were not factored into the formalities of UNRWA's setup when it was created. And over the decades, we could also argue that their absence from this formal structure reflects their broader marginalization and the attempts we've seen from numerous parties around the world to try and silence them across their political history. However, despite this formal exclusion, in practice, Palestinian refugees have, of course, interacted with UNRWA in 2 key ways. Firstly, and primarily as recipients of UNRWA services and programs, but secondly, and no less importantly, as staff. So as many of this audience will be aware, more than 90% of UNRWA staff are themselves Palestinian refugees. In fact, there are some estimates that put the figure as high as 99%. And in fact, in view of this figure, we might question the very title of this panel and whether it's even really valid to speak about a relationship between UNRWA as one entity and the Palestinian refugees as another, as though they're entirely separate. It might really make more sense to think in terms of hybridity, to see UNRWA as a hybrid model or a hybrid body that has, within its complicated structure, numerous competing actors pushing their various claims of ownership over the agency. Now, of these various competing actors, it is, of course, the Palestinian refugees who have the least formal power. Even though they do comprise the vast majority of UNRWA staff, they're disproportionately found on the junior levels. Senior management tends to be dominated by internationals and has always been dominated by so-called internationals who are usually Westerners. And yet, regardless of their structural disempowerment, the Palestinian refugees have nevertheless continuously made use of the limited leverage they do have in order to exert their influence and push forward their claims to ownership over UNRWA, to declare that it's actually their agency. And what's more, they've sometimes done so with considerable success. And this is where I'd like to turn to history, as I said at the outset. So to understand how the Palestinian refugees have sought to declare and promote their claims of ownership over UNRWA, we need to consider what their main demands towards the agency have usually been. And for this, I'd like to quote Salah Salah, who's a Palestinian refugee himself and head of the PNC Refugee Committee. He once told me that the Palestinian refugees have had and continue to have 2 major grievances regarding UNRWA. The first concerns the feeling that UNRWA is not providing adequate services, that it's not sufficiently investing in its provision of programs and aid and welfare to the refugees. Of course, there are all kinds of reasons for this, many of which are beyond UNRWA's control, as we heard this morning. But nevertheless, this, according to Salah, is the first major long-running grievance. And the second is the grievance that UNRWA, or the feeling that UNRWA is not sufficiently representing the Palestinian refugees' political rights. I think this is something we heard about in the questions this morning, right? There's a feeling that UNRWA should be doing more to push forward the Palestinians' political rights, and that in some sense, UNRWA serves as a representative for the Palestinians, who are, of course, stateless, particularly in the UN sphere. So if we keep both of these grievances in mind, we can find them running throughout the continual tensions between UNRWA and its Palestinian refugee staff over the last 7 decades. Now, to give one example, again, this was touched on in the Q&A before the break, we've seen continual strikes among UNRWA staff, not only in recent years, but really over the decades. So this is actually a newspaper story from 1981. I don't know how well you can all see it, but it's reporting on the sixth week of an UNRWA staff strike all the way back in 1981. This was a strike by Palestinian staff demanding fairer pay and working conditions. I have to confess, as a UK academic currently on strike for the same thing, I feel some affinity with it. But notably, I would imagine most of you can't read the text, but it's mentioned, and it's significant that a large number of those on strike at this time were teachers in UNRWA schools. So as many of us will be aware, education has been and continues to be UNRWA's largest program in terms of budget and personnel and resources, and the vast majority of teachers in the UNRWA schools have always been Palestinians, and usually Palestinian refugees themselves. What's more, Palestinian teachers in UNRWA schools unionized very early on and were very effective in protesting, were very active, I should say, in organizing collective industrial action to protest for their rights as laborers, often but not exclusively around fairer pay. So in this case, we can see a very clear alignment with what Salah identified as the first major grievance of Palestinian refugees about UNRWA, which is the complaint that it's not sufficiently investing in its services. We can see this as including resources such as staff, human resources. There's a complaint that it's not fulfilling its mandate in providing sufficient funding for the education program. However, it's vital to keep in mind that these kinds of grievances and these complaints are not only about UNRWA's mandate or about services. Any grievance over UNRWA service is also in many senses a political issue. So Palestinian refugees have historically seen UNRWA's work not as charity, but as a right. There's a strong idea that UNRWA services are an entitlement held by Palestinian refugees because the UN and the so-called international community in general holds considerable responsibility for their plight. The UN and the international community first facilitated partition of Palestine in 1947, then failed to protect Palestinian rights in the subsequent 2 years, and since then have continually failed to implement Palestinian refugee rights. So accordingly, the plight of the Palestinian refugees is in a large part attributable to the actions of the UN and the international community, and as such, the UN has a duty to provide services to them until their plight is resolved. Now, we can see that kind of thinking reflected here. This is an extract of a letter I found in my research in the UNRWA archive all the way back in 1961. So again, it's a long-running complaint. This was written by the head of the Student Union of Palestinian students in UNRWA schools in Damascus, and you can see the chair has written here, it's the duty of UNRWA to alleviate the pains of the Palestine refugees. The responsible persons in UNRWA are called not to forget that the people of Palestine have been wronged and oppressed, and it is the duty of those who cause this oppression to secure for them tranquility and ease. So several things about this language are quite striking. Firstly, we see the word duty come up more than once. So this is an obligation, not an act of charity. And also this letter talks about or implies that UNRWA is part of the wider system that caused the Palestinian refugees' oppression or situation. So from this perspective, in the eyes of many Palestinian refugees, UNRWA services were not welfare, but they were in fact a political right or entitlement. And again, we can see this conveyed very explicitly in 2 quotations here. One is from a group called the Badge of the Arab Palestine Youth. This was an informal organization of young Palestinian refugees in Lebanon in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And they issued a statement to UNRWA in 1960 where they explicitly said, "The services of our agency are our rights and not favors or charity from her." Also striking here that they refer to UNRWA as our agency, so a very explicit declaration of ownership over the agency and a feeling of it as being, in some senses, belonging to the refugees. And then nearly 20 years later, we have a similar statement cropping up in a letter from the leader of Balata camp in the West Bank to the UNRWA Commissioner General, where he says, "We are your responsibility and you should provide us with relief, care and services." So we can see this idea is crops up again and again over time and across the various fields where UNRWA operates. From this perspective, when UNRWA services are being cut, it's not just an issue in humanitarian terms, it's actually an infringement of Palestinian rights. And as such, in going on strike for them or in protesting for them, the Palestinian refugees argue they're not only campaigning for their labor rights or their humanitarian rights, they're also campaigning for their political and even their national rights. This, in many ways, is what the historian and anthropologist Ilana Feldman has referred to as the right to be political, the Palestinian refugees' right to be political. Again, it chimes with much of what we heard this morning, and it's worth briefly considering what's meant by this. As we know, UNRWA was created in the late 1940s. I just realized I didn't print off the last page of my presentation, so let's wing it. Okay. So, UNRWA was created in the late 1940s as part of the emerging new sector of humanitarianism. This was a sector which was influenced by, among other things, the legacies of colonialism, and as such, it tended to construct aid recipients from the global south as objects to whom humanitarian aid should be administered. They were not constructed within this as actors or as political agents. Now, I don't want to go too far in criticizing UNRWA on this because UNRWA was by no means unique. I'm talking about a period 70 years ago, and I'm talking about a much wider culture that UNRWA was the product of. Things have changed since then. But part of the reason things have changed is because of the refusal of aid recipients across the global south, including Palestinian refugees, to accept the fact that they've been constructed simply as humanitarian objects. They sought to reposition themselves and to assert themselves as actors within the process. We can see this, obviously, in their strikes and campaigns for their labor rights, in how they repositioned UNRWA services as a political entitlement and not merely charity. But we can also see it in more overtly, explicitly political campaigns from the refugees. And to give an example of this, I want to return briefly to education. So as I mentioned, the vast majority of teachers in UNRWA schools have been and continue to be Palestinian refugees themselves. Here are a couple of pictures of Palestinian refugee teachers at work in schools. Both of these are in Jordan over the decades of UNRWA's work. And in addition to campaigning for their rights as UNRWA staff, the teachers were often also actively involved in campaigning for their right to express their identity as Palestinians in their teaching and to convey this to their Palestinian students. Now, one particular grievance here over the decades has been the content of the curricula that are taught in UNRWA schools. Because as many of you will be aware, UNRWA schools use the curricula of the host states in which they are located. So those in Lebanon use the Lebanese curricula, in Jordan they use the Jordanian curricula, etc. In the West Bank and Gaza, since Oslo, they have used more Palestinian-specific developed curricula as part of the PA structures, but I'm talking more historically before we've got to that stage. Now, the reason the use of host state curricula was controversial is because most of these curricula did not contain a huge amount of teaching about Palestinian-specific history, and particularly the Nakba. So either it would be mentioned as part of a wider discussion of Arab history, or in the case of Lebanon, it wasn't really mentioned at all. And this was a cause of grievance because many Palestinian refugees felt that the younger generations weren't really being taught to understand their situation. Why was it they were living as refugees? And why was it they were finding themselves stateless? I have another quote here from Fawaz Turki, who's himself a Palestinian refugee from Haifa. He left as a child during the Nakba, and he was educated in an UNRWA school in Lebanon. And he later made this statement, there can be similar sentiments found across refugee testimonies where he talked about how UNRWA schools were designed or had the effect of raising Palestinian children on and educating them in accepting their plight of life as a preordained thing. He says no attempt was made to explain the situation and the forces behind it, and then explicitly no courses were offered to show where they came from, the history of Palestine. Now, we can critique this up to a point because the history of Palestine did come up in many of the Arab host state curricula, just not in a lot of detail. And probably more importantly for our purposes, it was also the practice of many Palestinian teachers, not to mention parents and families, to ensure that younger generation did know the history of Palestine. But nevertheless, there was a strong campaign for a more formal inclusion of these subjects in the curriculum, and strikingly, the Palestinian teachers' unions included this in numerous strike demands over the decades, often in alliance with student unions as well. In fact, their attempts briefly bore fruit in the 1970s in Lebanon, when UNRWA agreed to include Palestinian history and Palestinian geography in its schools there, although the plan to implement this was never fully rolled out because of the impact of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. Nevertheless, it's striking as a case study of Palestinian refugee success in agitating to recreate UNRWA in their own image. So, final slide, because I can see you. Sorry, Mick. I've stolen your intellectual property. There we go. Final slide. What does all of this mean for us today as we consider UNRWA at 70? Firstly, I would highlight the importance of remembering that UNRWA does not exist separately to the Palestinian refugees. It is very much entwined with them, and in fact, the vast majority of UNRWA staff are themselves Palestinian refugees. And secondly, as we understandably get caught up in discussing the top-down dynamics of political international diplomacy around UNRWA, it's vital not to forget the voices of the Palestinian refugees themselves, which they have struggled to express continuously over the last 7 decades. That's it. I might have more to say on the final page of the printout.
Thank you, Anne. That's a masterclass in how to wing it. If you hadn't told us, we'd have never have guessed. So I want to move immediately to our next speaker. Michael Dumper is a professor in Middle East politics at the University of Exeter. His research is primarily on future options for Palestinian refugees and the city of Jerusalem. He's the author of a number of books, most recently, The Politics of Sacred Space, the Old City of Jerusalem and the Middle East Conflict. Michael.
Right, thank you, Ben, and thank you very much to the organisers for inviting me. Can you hear me at the back? Yeah. My first actually connection with UNRWA was when I was a 19-year-old student, and they used to run summer camps in Gaza. And in '77, I was a volunteer English language teacher in Deir al-Balah camp, and it's been a really interesting journey watching UNRWA change and develop over that time, and I'm very pleased to be invited to this. Anniversaries are sad occasions, particularly the UNRWA anniversaries, because we don't wish it to continue forever, and it seems to be carrying on. There are moments for reflection, and we're really having some of that already. Here, I'd like to think a little bit about the future, so a bit of speculation. And I can see the title is Responding to Crises and Building a Just Future. And it feels to me that we need to know what's coming around the corner, what's on the horizon, in order to see how we can achieve this just future. So what I want to do is take stock of the role of UNRWA as an actor in Middle East politics, and identify some of the key trends globally and regionally and locally which are impacting the work of UNRWA, and then unpack one or two of these and how they might affect the future role of the agency. It's very important that you understand that when I do this, I'm not saying this is what should happen, and I'm not saying this is what I want to happen. I feel I have the uncomfortable task of looking a little bit into the future, and it's not such a good future, but I feel it's important that we need to unpack it and talk openly about it. So the best way to start really is to just sort of, where are we at? And I think we've sort of, I won't go through these slides, but we've got a sort of a variety of views of people who feel that UNRWA is a cause for the perpetuation of the conflict, while others who are also critical of UNRWA on the Palestinian side feel it's a stooge of the imperialistic and donor community, and in some sense UNRWA is caught between these two sets of critics. I won't go into detail because I don't really have much time, but these slides, you're welcome to have a copy later on. So what I want to do is look at the global level, the regional, and at the local. And I'll rip through this quite quickly, I'm afraid. So what is happening globally? We've got what is clearly thought as a decline in the US role in the Middle East, and possibly the rise in Chinese and Russian foreign policy interventions across the Middle East. The European Union is preoccupied with integration of Eastern Europe and distracted from the concerns there, and is also particularly preoccupied by the Syrian civil war and the fear of mass migration, both from Libya, the south of the Mediterranean Sea, and to the east. The rise of protectionism and popularism as a result of the 2008 financial crisis is making people less inclined to be involved in humanitarian assistance. And also there's this huge issue of climate change, which is beginning to supersede people's concerns about humanitarian assistance around the world. People are more and more concerned about the climate change issue, and therefore there's a diminishment of the resources available. We've also got the emergence of new power centres. Big mega cities are becoming more and more important, dwarfing sometimes the power of states to act, and sometimes cities are where the largest political action is taken. So there's a different configuration going on in terms of what sort of actors do you need to get on board. And obviously we know this religious ideologies becoming and identities becoming very important, and identification with particular states perhaps taking a lesser role. But these kind of global issues involved, and some of this can be seen from the US National Intelligence Council, which advises the Department of Defense, where they're sort of trying to look at the power of the different major countries. And by adding up all these different elements, the US is obviously in advance, ahead, but it is also projecting into the future, where we've got this position here where we're in 2020, where the US is obviously ahead, but by 2035, China rises, and India also rises by 2045, 2050. These are two different kinds of calculations, but actually the overall picture is very similar. So what's happening more locally in the Middle East? Well, obviously we have the Syrian civil war, and I won't go into that, but the ramifications of that are enormous in terms of absorbing political will, resources, and also the balance of power in the region. Sucking in external intervention. The Arab world is increasingly fragmented. The idea of Arab unity is sometimes now laughed at, and the chances of that being repaired in the future is quite remote. Israel can act with impunity in the Middle East. It's clearly the strongest military power, and it's able to act without really any other sort of constraints on its activities. There is a sense in which the spread of UN universal values has really taken the back seat, and there's much more adherence to religious ideologies, and making it really difficult to kind of establish human rights as a kind of the baseline by which policies are formulated or judged. And then you have this failure of the Palestinian-Israeli negotiations, and the possible collapse of the Palestinian National Authority, leaving no political horizon for the Palestinian refugees and their supporters. So if you turn to UNRWA, well, I don't want to repeat what you've heard this morning. I'm sorry I missed it. I was on the train coming from Exeter this morning and I couldn't get here earlier. So I don't want to repeat about that, but obviously there is the crisis is there, it's ongoing, and there's a lot of issues around funding. But perhaps we could just refer to some of talk a bit about the demography. We can see, I think it's in the next picture, you can see a rise in the population. This is from the medium-term strategy report. These figures need slightly updating again, but that's you can see the huge increase coming, which means it's just going up and up and up. And so this obviously has quite an impact on what UNRWA can continue to provide if the budget doesn't increase. Particularly the demography, the profile of refugees is changing. There are more and more older people who have particular health needs which require different kinds of resources. So not the same as the resources that were 30 or 40 years ago. It's a different kind of medical attention is required. And so that's a big call on the budget. I think the insulin bill for UNRWA is the highest in the developed world, developing world. There's been increase in the special hardship cases. There's a real problem, and it was mentioned earlier this morning, of the disaffected youth and underemployment. And then we have already heard about quite a politicized workforce, which doesn't always work in hand with the senior management. This again is taken from the MTS, the Medium-Term Strategy Report, and you can see how the breakdown, I'm not sure how clear it is at the back, but you can see how clear what it will look like in 2021. That is what UNRWA is planning for in 2021. Sort of step back a little bit from the specifics, a little more general. There is pressures on UNRWA in terms of its position as a UN actor is being eroded. It's been seen as a partisan force, just pro-Palestinian, and it's been pushed into that position by lots of media coverage, but by hostile opponents. There's a sense in which, because of the problems that the host countries are having themselves, its influence in able to protect Palestinians is undermined. Particularly, you can see this in Syria. And there is all this competition between the donors, the refugees, the host countries, and other agencies. And there's been a bit of an issue around, Gaza needs a particular kind of framework, Lebanon needs a particular kind of framework, so does Jordan, and trying to get the consistency across the fields of operation is quite difficult. However, let's sort of say, well, before we sort of look into the future, what has UNRWA got with it? What's it bringing with it? Apart from the numbers of people as employees, it's very interesting to see that in comparison to other agencies, international agencies, UNRWA is actually in the field close to the beneficiaries. It's got its offices, its equipment, its personnel in the field. It doesn't have to send out people from Geneva or New York in order to execute particular decisions. So it's very responsive. It's also 90% of the staff are Palestinian, and so therefore they understand the situation very clearly. And the education system has been regarded as the best in the Middle East. I know some people have caveats about the methodology of the World Bank report, but still in relation to the other Middle Eastern education systems, it's regarded as still the best. And the schools have a very, very important role in remaining open at times of crisis to give stability and security to students when these crises take place. Another very strong thing in its favour is the role of international law. Everything UNRWA does has to be compliant with international law, so there's a transparency and an accountability there. which is very, very important, which sometimes is over and above what you might expect from other organisations, and has strong international support as a result. I'll just skip this one. Now, we talked about I think this morning Rachel talked about the budget cuts. And actually, before I go on, I would just like to mention here, there was a huge crisis. They nearly had to shut down the agency. We've probably heard all that. But I think I need to give credit to the departing Commissioner General Pierre Cranbull, who, despite what criticisms there have been of him, was very responsible in marshalling funds to keep the agency going at a very, very critical time. And it's a real shame that whatever took place has led to his departure. But I think UNRWA owes, and refugees owe him a debt of thanks for maintaining the funding during this particular difficult period. What was particularly difficult for UNRWA was that there was no preparation. It wasn't phased out. It was a sudden, instantaneous shock, and I think that made it very, very difficult for the agency to respond. And it was clearly not necessarily UNRWA that was the sole target. It was also attacking the Palestinian National Authority, and has had the impact of slightly detaching the US from the discussions around the future, either of the agency and of the Palestinian situation. You probably had this discussion about what would have been the impact if the funds hadn't come through. UNRWA was able to respond very, very well. It set up, it diversified its donor support. It's discussing with the World Bank, a trust fund, talking about Islamic endowments. It received strong solidarity from many of the Arab states, particularly Jordan. And there's interestingly, the Israeli intelligence is very concerned about UNRWA collapsing because of the impact it would have on Gaza and the West Bank, and obviously on Jordan. So what we have is a situation where UNRWA is in some senses slightly stronger in terms of a diversification of its donor base, but we have no idea how long this will continue. So there's some positives, but it is extremely unsure about its future. So, thinking about the future, I've just pulled 3 out of the sky. Okay, there's others you can look at. We can look at Trump being re-elected in. Oh no, you know, there's. I'm not. Don't laugh. There's issues in the Middle East. I mean, I just pulled these out as things I've discussed with people at length in different fora. So, and again, this is not something that I say should happen, but I'm saying this is the kind of thing that might happen. So, the renewal of the mandate was difficult this time round. There were some countries made their support contingent on various changes and decisions that UNRWA would need to take. Next time round, it might be harder, and they may have more leverage. And this sort of US-Israeli agenda of somehow making the refugees in Jordan, who have Jordanian passports, no longer refugees and therefore no longer entitled to under the UNHCR kind of criteria, wouldn't be entitled to assistance in the same way, refugee assistance, may be adopted by other donor countries. That is a possibility. It certainly has been discussed. Am I nearly there? Okay. All right. What I want to look at is number 3. I'll just look at it in a bit more detail. Here is possibly the collapse of the Palestinian National Authority, what impact it might have on UNRWA. So, clearly, there will be some transfer of Palestinian functions to UNRWA. Additional schools, health clinics, some other educational programs, and some possibly representational issues. There'll be definitely all the refugees that were using the P&A services will come flooding back to UNRWA. The ones that were starting to go into the state schools, the Palestinian state schools, would start coming back to UNRWA schools. Israeli activities in the West Bank will probably lead to the more expulsion of refugees. UNRWA will find it harder and harder to move around. Access to Jerusalem will be even more difficult, and there'll be more and more restrictions on staff getting access to people and providing aid. More on the political level, it would mark the end of the two-state solution, and some donors may say, well, what is the point at UNRWA in the future? The West Bank itself might be fragmented into militias, Nablus, Hebron, because the money's not there to support the police. There's 60,000 policemen who will need paying. They might all kind of divide up into small militias. And again, this will have an impact on UNRWA's services. Perhaps it's not all, may not all be bad. On one hand, Israel will not be annexing the West Bank and giving citizenship to the people in the West Bank. So there'll be increasingly apartheid type, or more obviously an apartheid type system, which might increase support for Palestinians. It might increase, in fact, UNRWA's funding, because people will say, well, UNRWA is the only institution, like in Gaza, it's the only institution the international community trusts, so a lot more money will go into UNRWA. We don't know. No, I'm just imagining things. Some of the funding and service provision might be shifted to other agencies, including Israeli state agencies in the West Bank, and this may free UNRWA from all the hassle of finding the money and all the employee issues that are attached to that. You might have the situation where, like in Gaza, the role of UNRWA as a kind of quasi de facto representative of the Palestinian refugees is increased. It's a role that UNRWA clearly has resisted, does not want to supersede the PLO, but in the absence of the PNA, the trend may be pushing UNRWA more and more to that, which will make it difficult for UNRWA politically. So, just to kind of sum up, I think the challenges at UNRWA are not just about money, they're deep existential ones, about the politics. It's unlikely UNRWA will continue in the same way as before. We're kind of assuming we're just going to lurch from one crisis to another and it will continue, but it's very unlikely it will do so. There'll be definitely a decline in the role of the Palestinian refugees in the world's attention, and if you're thinking even beyond another 20 years, it's very hard to envisage UNRWA existing and having an anniversary at 19. We may actually be, there may be a situation where a new mandate is enforced onto UNRWA through the General Assembly, and the discourse might change from refugee rights to the rights of indigenous peoples, like in New Zealand or Australia or Native American in Canada and North America. So what I'm thinking is that, okay, it may not be happening next year or the year after, but we, like the climate crisis, we have to plan in advance. And certainly consultation with Palestinian refugees must be at the heart of this. They must be involved in thinking through, strategizing what is going to happen. And there is a real imbalance. While on one hand there's a very strong legal case for the Palestinian refugee rights, the donors have a very strong control over the operational side of things. And that is a balance which at the moment has worked in the Palestinian favour, but it may not always work in the Palestinians' favour in the future. So what I'm suggesting is that this fear that we have that if we talk about these things, we might engender a self-fulfilling dynamic, I think is actually a mistake. We need to talk about these things in order to start putting some things in place so that what comes out, what evolves, is much more configured to what the Palestinian refugee needs. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. There's a huge amount of information from those two presentations for us to chew on, and the spectre of another Trump term being waved before us is always very good to help us focus our minds, I think. We've got some time for Q&A. We can go a little bit, I think, into the lunch period. So I'm going to, I think, try and take 3 questions at a time. We'll see if we've got time to come back for another round. I'm going to ask people, because we are challenged for time, please to be really focused. So please make it a question, and ideally make it a short, focused question. So, gentlemen here. Okay. Can I have the other hands up who are up so I can just catch everyone? And we'll go here afterwards and here.
Thank you so much for your presentations. My question for Anne. As development professional, I think the best aid is to build the capacity of local authorities so they can take the lead on the future, because aid can't be forever. So my question is specifically for the UNRWA's work in the Gaza and West Bank. Do you think, from your research historically, that the UNRWA has somehow undermined the capacity of the Palestinian Authority to the extent that today we are talking about scenarios of the collapse of this authority? Thank you.
Okay. Down here at the front.
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to pick up on one of the comments from Mick's presentation, which was the discussion of the shifting of some services potentially to Israel and potential future there. And one thing UNRWA is looking at right now, and I think would be worth brainstorming here and perhaps outside of this scenario, is the fact that attempts to remove UNRWA or for Israel to take over its services in the absence of any current alternative solution are governed very strictly under various laws. First of all, of course, we have the Comey-Micklemore Agreement of 1967 with the Israeli authorities. Our position is not that that is a consent to us being in the territory of the OPT. A, because we predated occupation. B, because international humanitarian law dictates and governs the rights of the occupied people, and any changes, certainly in the demographic in the occupied region and potential annexation, is governed by the 4th Geneva Convention.
Okay, thank you. And gentleman over here in the second row.
Hello. Yeah, a question for Michael. So do you think with the removal of US funding from UNRWA, it will release the potential for UNRWA to become more political?
Okay, so Anne, do you want to take the first one?
Okay, so your question was about whether UNRWA has weakened the PA. I know what you're getting at in the sense that having these sort of dual quasi-governmental systems in place could be seen as undermining the role of the PA, but I think it's probably not accurate to say that UNRWA has been a factor in weakening the PA. So when, as you're probably aware, when the Oslo system was put into place, initially there was talk about gradually transferring UNRWA services over to the PA as part of what was meant to be an interim 5-year period leading up to a Palestinian state. And in fact, for example, as part of that, some of UNRWA's archives were given to or shared with the Institute for Palestine Studies as a precursor to that. I think what's really undermined the capacity of the PA is bigger structural features around the inherent flaws in the Oslo system and shifts in Israeli and international politics away from supporting it. You could also make the case that UNRWA has actually been quite significant in allowing us to continue to speak about Palestinian refugees in the West Bank and Gaza. And ensuring that that remains part of the international discourse on the West Bank and Gaza, which otherwise could risk being lost. So I would say not on that front, even though I understand the question.
Yeah, just there's 2 points. I mean, Rachel's point that Israel is constrained by international law and what it can do in terms of taking over UNRWA institutions. I completely accept that. I'm just envisaging a situation where those laws are ignored, and there's very little response from the international community. I mean, frankly, who is going to stop Israel doing what it wants in the West Bank if it decides to take these things over? So, yes, the laws are there, but I'm not sure if the ability to make Israel compliant is there. Regarding the potential of UNRWA without US funding, I know there has been some positives in the sense of the diversification of the donor base, and which has brought in many actors from different parts of the world, and not just European and Arab countries, and that's been an excellent response. I do think it's I mean, the United States has been extraordinarily generous over the years of UNRWA's existence, and to ignore that money, I think would be very poor planning. At some point, if it comes back, UNRWA may be in a stronger position to not have the same conditionality playing on it, because when it accepts US money, it has to do all kinds of things with that money in ways that only the US are insisting on, and that has a knock-on effect on the other donors, and that's quite a burden. But if I just wonder if, because the United States may want to give money, donate more money to UNRWA, because this is the ticket to being involved in negotiations about its future, UNRWA may have a little bit more control over how that money is received and allocated.
Thank you. I'm getting the signal we may have time just for 2 more questions if they're short and focused. Are there any further questions? So if we take one here, and there was a hand, Tim over here. So these 2. So it could 4th row there. Thank you.
My question for both of you, you have spoken about top-down perspective. What about down-top perspective? The role of Palestinians themselves. I asked this question before, but I am really very interested because with the lack of the funding and with the lack of opportunities, how do you see the role of Palestinians themselves as an active agent, not passive recipients of aid? So how you see it, because you didn't mention it here, and maybe for the future, and I would like to understand more from you as well about the role of us as Palestinians. Thank you.
And over here in the 2nd row.
Thank you. Tim Hogan. You say that the United States has been extraordinarily generous. We know that. It's been extraordinarily generous to Israel, and it is still being extraordinarily generous to what is the terrorist state of Israel. Now, 10 years ago, John Gay, we all remember him broadcasting from Gaza when Palestinian children were being killed daily by terrorist Israelis. It's still going on, and we're still talking about it. What is the solution?
Okay, that's an easy one to come back in 1 minute, I think. But do you want to take both questions, Anne, if you go first?
Sure, I'll just speak really briefly. So your question was about the role of Palestinian refugees. I mean, in some ways it's a huge question, but in another way it's a very straightforward question, because the role of Palestinian refugees is arguably not for me to say. It's being declared already by Palestinian refugees themselves on the ground and in their activism within and outside camps and within and beyond UNRWA's fields of operations. So I wouldn't attempt to try and summarize it in 30 seconds. but I think it's clear that it's clear from history and from the contemporary situation that any attempt to address this situation while disregarding the Palestinian refugees is not going to work.
Thank you. Regarding the consultation, I think UNRWA has tried in many different ways to involve refugees in some of the decision making. Some of it is cosmetic. Some of it is, that these is something that looks really good on the website and on the photographs that have the student parliaments that they have and such. But some of it is genuine, and the negotiations that they have with the trade unions and also with some of the works councils and different dialogue they have in the camps I think is quite genuine stuff. But we have to recognize the fact that for Palestinians to have agency, they have to have their own Palestinians to exercise their own will, their own determination. They have to have their own agency, and that's what the PLO is. And if that's not functioning very well, that's something that the Palestinians need to work at. UNRWA can't devolve decision-making to the Palestinian refugees because the money won't be given. Once it does that, the people, the donors will not give it any money. And so it's caught. It wants to have the Palestinian refugees involved as much as possible, but there's certain, it's accountable to basically the donors, and that's really quite a difficult dilemma for it to deal with. What is the solution? Well, there is what is best for Palestinian refugees, and I think a lot of you have your own ideas on this, and I would agree with them. I think what we need to talk about is what is the best solution in the current circumstances or in the likely circumstances in the future, and that's not necessarily going to be that great for the Palestinian refugees. I mean, if you're dispossessed from your property and return to it the day after, nobody has a problem with that. If you return 2 weeks later, that's not so bad. You return three years after, that's possible as well. If you return 30 years later, or try to return 30 years later, there's other problems have evolved. And it's just more complicated. Now, we are talking about 60, 70 years now, and we may talk about 80 years before people can return. And the problems, it doesn't mean Palestinian rights are less, it's just that other people's rights have increased. And I don't think there's a solution to that, and in the end there has to be some sort of quid pro quo, some sort of compromise, because those new rights that are emerging from the settler groups, from the I'm sorry, but people who don't put me in the position of defending the acquisition of Palestinian property. I'm just trying to say that it's more complicated the longer time passes.
Taking land by their army and by force, that doesn't give them rights to increase their rights at all.
I'm just, I completely agree with you, but I completely agree with you. It's just that they are asserting certain rights. They're saying they and I don't think that's necessarily just, but that is what's happening. And I think you need to confront that situation. It is complicated the longer that time passes.
I believe that in Palestine the situation is very bad, and there's many difficulties on getting the rights and this stuff. But if we start calling these things in this way, this would be increasing, and the things would be changed. If we started now saying they have rights, and by the time that it's raising this stuff, by 10 years from now, they will say you will not hear before. So
I agree. But that is what.
They took it by force, and we have the right to return.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, I knew there was a danger in taking that question just before lunch, but look, we've got time over lunch, and I'm sure afterwards to address that fundamental question of how do we ensure that the core collective rights of the Palestinian people that are under greater threat than they have been at any time over the last 70 years are realised, and how we hold Israel to account. So we're going to break for lunch now. I'm just checking, what time do you want people back, Pietro? So if people can return by 1:30, and before we go, can I just ask you to give a final round of applause to our two panelists? Thank you. And if you can reconvene here at 1:30. Thank you.
ينظمه مركز الجزيرة للدراسات ومركز العودة الفلسطيني بالاشتراك مع المركز الأوروبي للدراسات الفلسطينية بجامعة إكستر البريطانية. لندن، 30 من نوفمبر 2019. في الذكرى 70 لتأسيسها، رغم تعرض وكالة الأونروا للاستهداف من قبل إسرائيل وقطع التمويل الأمريكي، فإنها لا تزال تؤدي عملها. ما هو الدور المنتظر منها في مساعدة اللاجئين الفلسطينيين؟ وهل لا يزال يعول عليها في نضال اللاجئين من أجل عودتهم إلى ديارهم؟ الأونروا، تحديات الاستجابة للأزمات والسعي نحو بناء مستقبل عادل. مؤتمر بحثي ينظمه مركز الجزيرة